the early hours of the morning of December 4th, 1979, Edith Hasty, a 34-year-old mother of 7, awoke with a start. She was overcome with a powerful feeling of unease, perhaps born of a mother's sixth sense that her children were in terrible danger. She shared her home at 12 Shelby Street in the small English port city of Hull with her 4 sons, Charlie 15, Paul 12, Thomas 9, and 8-year-old Peter. She had only bid them good night less than an hour earlier. Her 3 daughters were staying nearby with friends and relatives, so the house had been relatively quiet for once. Dashing out onto the landing, she screamed as she saw flames shooting up the stairs. The wooden banister was already so hot it burned her hand. Waking up her 15-year-old son Charlie, the pair went back to the landing in an attempt to rescue 9-year-old Thomas, who slept in the same room as his mother, since he suffered from muscular dystrophy and had great difficulty walking. But they were beaten back by the flames and smoke and returned to the front bedroom, where Charlie frantically pushed his panicking mother out of the window, despite the 15-foot drop onto the concrete path outside. Edith injured her ankle in the fall, but struggled to her feet to urge Charlie to jump after her. Her eldest son ignored her pleas, determined to rescue his brothers, Paul and Peter, who were still asleep in the same room. However, all 3 boys soon found themselves trapped by the flames and smoke, which the draft from the open bedroom window had intensified. By the time the alarm was raised and fire services arrived at the scene, Paul, Peter, and Charlie were suffering from burns over 70 to 85% of their bodies. Only 9-year-old Thomas was rescued with less serious burns. Over the following 2 weeks, Paul, Peter, and Charlie would all die of their injuries. Firemen immediately suspected that the fire was no accident, and Hull's deputy chief of the CID, Detective Superintendent Ronald Sagar, was sent to the scene. He arrived at the gutted, smoldering house to be shown 2 spent matches found near the mailbox outside. He also noted a strong smell of paraffin, which he thought strange, since if paraffin had started the fire, it would surely have been swallowed up in the fire, and any smell would have gone with it. He spotted a pool of the flammable liquid a few feet from the door, as if someone had set a can there after pouring its contents through the mailbox slot. Later that morning, forensic examinations confirmed his theory that the fire had started by the front door, underneath the letterbox, after several pints of paraffin had been poured onto the carpet, followed by lighted newspaper. There was no doubt about it. Someone had deliberately set out to burn down a family home, and what had started as an arson inquiry was soon to become an investigation into 3 shocking child murders. Despite being England's 10th largest city, the northeastern city of Hull is geographically somewhat out on a limb, one of those places most people rarely have cause to travel through, and which rarely distinguishes itself. The area of Hull where the fire took place, about half a mile west of the city centre, was a poor, run-down area, and much of its community spirit had been eroded down the years due to the poverty, unemployment, and crime that had been spreading ever since the city's decline as a major fishing port had set in during the early 1970s. Nevertheless, Detective Superintendent Sagar was surprised at how reluctant the area's residents were to offer his officers any help with their inquiries, and shocked at the level of animosity they expressed towards the Hasty family, despite the tragic events of that night. Then again, the Hasties were a family whose reputation preceded them. When he had been woken in the early hours to be told there was a fire at the Hasty family house, Sagar hadn't needed any more information, despite the fact that there were probably 20 families of that name in the city. The Hasties they spoke of were well known to local police. The father, Tommy Hasty, was a habitual petty criminal who at the time was 5 months into a jail sentence for burglaring a nearby sports club along with his eldest son, the latest in a long string of offenses for which he had been convicted. The fact that he was happy for his son to be his partner in crime might help explain why the younger member of the Hasty clan had become notorious for running riot around the neighborhood. Barely a day went by without the police being called to another incident involving them stoning elderly residents, vandalizing local amenities, and smashing up neighboring houses. They urinated through letterboxes, defecated on doorsteps, and robbed local children of their pocket money. Sometimes it appeared that the Hasties were a one-family crime wave. Detective Sagar claims to have found the father of the house, Tommy Hasty, a likable rogue, and said of the Hasty boys in the Hull Daily Mail, they may have been somewhat mischievous at times, but they didn't deserve to die like this. Yet residents of the neighborhood were rather less charitable in their comments about the family, despite the appalling tragedy that had befallen them. Indeed, such was the shocking level of animosity being expressed towards the family even after the tragedy, that the local press immediately dubbed the area the Street of Hate. Never before have I encountered such hatred and dislike for a family, Sagar admitted. This naturally led police to look for a neighbor with a grudge, but no likely suspects were brought to their attention. Many police felt the community was hiding something. They weren't to know that there was a rather different explanation for the deafening silence. A dark force was at work in their midst, which even the most eagle-eyed among them had failed to notice. Because of the Hasty family's deep unpopularity in the local area, there was no shortage of potential suspects for the fire attack on their home. Many of the Hasty's neighbors were no strangers to the police either, and would be unlikely to pursue the official channels if they had a problem with another family. Could one, or more, of them be capable of burning down a house where they knew children would be asleep? It was an unthinkable prospect, but one that seemed only too real given the circumstances. Some cruel gossip mongers even whispered that Mother Edie Hasty herself must be responsible. Indeed, since it is common police practice to look at those nearest the victims when a crime of this kind has been committed, Sagar initially wondered if one of the absent Hasty girls set the fire after a family argument, but this possibility was dismissed almost as soon as it crossed his mind. There were other possible leads that quickly led nowhere. A few days after the fire, a story appeared in the Hull Daily Mail which told of a man who had been seen shortly after the first of the Hasty boys was pronounced dead in hospital, standing on a flyover overlooking the street, muttering, "One down, 4 to go," to himself. A boy on a racing bicycle had also been spotted watching the fire from the flyover. However, both potential suspects were quickly eliminated from the inquiry. The most promising early line of inquiry surrounded a note which Edith Hasty had recalled being put through her letterbox some months earlier. She assumed it would have been burnt to a crisp in the fire, but miraculously, it was recovered intact from a part of the house that had escaped the worst of the blaze. The note had been written on the back of a cut-out piece of cardboard, snipped from a packet of cornflakes breakfast cereal. "A family of effing rubbish," bellowed the note. "We all hate you. You should all live on an island, Devil's Island. But I'm not kidding, but I promised you a bomb, and by hell, I'm not kidding. Why don't you just flit while you've got the chance? If we can't get you out normally, then we'll bastard well bomb you out, and that's too good for you." Strong words indeed. Could the anonymous letter writer have finally carried out his or her threat on December 4th? Sagar and his colleagues certainly thought so for a time, and went so far as to ask thousands of local residents to write the words of the above note on a piece of paper in order to check for handwriting similarities. Soon enough, they found the handwriting was identical to that of a frail old lady living nearby. She had been terrorized by the Hasty boys and wrote the note on a card to save on the cost of a stamp. Sagar was satisfied she could not have been the arsonist. Nevertheless, Edith Hasty was in no doubt that the killer or killers were those same neighbors who had endlessly complained about her son's behavior. The funerals of the 3 Hasty boys took place on January 4th, 1980. When the procession made its way down Selby Street on that freezing morning, local TV cameras filmed the unedifying spectacle as Edith Hasty screamed hysterically at onlookers, "It was one of you bastards. One of you in this street is the murderer." Her suspicions weren't so far from the truth, and yet murders of her family were to become only the final episode of a very long and scarcely believable story. In the absence of any information about the Hasty fire from the local community, the police had only one other major line of inquiry. This arose from an anonymous phone call received by officers at the Central Police Office in Hull the day after the fire. The caller reported seeing 2 men running from the direction of number 12 Selby Street around the same time that the fire had started. He hadn't noticed any sign of fire, but he had seen 2 men run to a Rover 2000 car parked nearby and then driven away by a third man. Police quickly traced the call to a nearby payphone and managed to apprehend the informant as he was walking away. He repeated his story at the police station, giving detailed descriptions of the two men. The scenario described fitted with another possible motive. The house next door to the Hasties was known to be a base for drug dealers. Perhaps the arsonists had set fire to the wrong house. Certainly, the description of the car at the time, a relatively upmarket saloon model, was the kind a successful drug dealer might conceivably own, and the involvement of several men, including a getaway driver, suggested a more organized attack. Detectives also bore in mind the comments of a forensic investigator who had remarked at the scene that the fire appeared to be the work of someone with experience of starting fires. They wasted no time in sounding out their regular network of informers among the local criminal fraternity, even those who wouldn't normally dream of informing on fellow villains. Crimes involving the death of children were usually an exception to any criminal code of silence, provoking such outrage that they would offer up any information they could. Yet, despite a few stories of drug deals gone wrong, no murderous feuds were uncovered which could possibly have led to an abortive arson attack. When no strong suspect had been identified after nearly 6 months of investigation, the police informants were begging to be left alone. One asked Sagar, "How long are you lot going to be buzzing around this neck of the woods? None of us knows nothing, and no good jobs are being done with you lot busying around this bloody place day and night. The lads ain't even nicking car radios as long as you lot's here. Nobody notes nothing. We'd all gladly grass on whoever done it, just to get you lot away from here." While Sagar and his team weren't about to lose any sleep over the difficulties they were giving the local petty criminals, in truth, they had worried all along about the veracity of the anonymous caller's story about the Rover car. Despite the fact he had been driving himself, at night, with only street lamps to illuminate his view, he went on to identify the color and type of car, the color and style of clothing of the two men down to the buttons on a t-shirt. Several of the things he said did not tally with the known facts about the fire. He was the only person in the area at the time, including a police car, who saw a Rover car in the area and two men like those described. The more they asked him, the more unlikely details he seemed to suddenly recall, which ultimately led police to dismiss him as an attention-seeking fantasist. According to Sagar in his book about the case, Hull, Hell and Fire, a few months later, the witness came back to the police and claimed that he had been mistaken and had actually seen the car on a different night altogether. To the police's intense frustration, another lead appeared to have come to nothing. Yet, during the course of their investigations, a fortuitous discovery had been made. One of the Rover car owners whom detectives had put under surveillance had turned out to be heavily involved in cruising for sex with teenage boys in the city's public restrooms. Locally known as rent boys, desperate young men would hang around such gay haunts, offering sexual favors in exchange for money. Could the arsonist have some connection with this seedy, secretive world? It was little more than a hunch, but police had nothing better to go on. By now it was June 1980, 6 months since the fire, and Detective Superintendent Sagar's superiors wanted to close the case and divert manpower elsewhere. It was Humberside Police's last throw of the dice. While one anonymous phone caller had been traced, sending Hull Police on a long but ultimately fruitless line of inquiry in their search for the arsonists who had killed 3 young boys, another went untraced. After the fire, the Hasty family had been rehoused in another area of the city. But one night just before Christmas, Tommy Hasty received an anonymous phone call from a man sobbing into the phone, saying, "I'm sorry I killed your kids." A couple of weeks later, the Central Police Station in Hull received a similar phone booth call confessing to starting the Hasty fire. When he was asked for his name, he wailed, "No, no, no," and put the phone down. In any well-publicized murder investigation, the police regularly have to deal with false confessions from crackpots and attention seekers, and this one was no different. But the call was recorded all the same, even though the identity of the caller could not be established. The trail had long since gone cold by the time Detective Superintendent Ron Sagar and his team decided to interview any local homosexuals who were known to frequent the same public restrooms as the Rover car driver they had followed. Among those interviewed was a 19-year-old man calling himself Bruce George Peter Lee. He had changed his name from Peter Dinsdale in the summer of 1979 in honor of his idol, kung fu film star Bruce Lee. And he said he not only knew Charlie Hasty, but had been involved in indecent behavior with him. This provided a definite, if not provable, connection between the eldest Hasty boy and the city's gay scene, so it was decided that several possible suspects would be brought in for questioning on the same day, and Sagar would accuse each of them in turn in the hope that the real killer would confess. It was a bluff, admitted Sagar in a 2002 television interview, but it was something that I found necessary to do. When Bruce Lee was brought in, Sagar read him his rights, then wasted no time. "Bruce," he said, "I'll be quite blunt with you. I think that you started that fire at the Hasty family's house, and that indecency with Charlie is probably the cause of it all somehow." Lee's reply stunned Sagar. "I didn't mean to kill them," he said. He went on to explain that he had set the fire to get back at Charlie Hasty, who had continually demanded money from Lee after mucking about, wanking, masturbating, and that. Hasty also threatened to tell the police about their indecency if Lee didn't keep giving him money. There was also another motive. Lee had become besotted with Charlie's 16-year-old sister, Angie. He had repeatedly asked her to be his girlfriend, but she rejected his advances. Indeed, she and her brothers regarded Lee as an irritating hanger-on and would take pleasure in mocking him. Indeed, Lee, who had an educationally subnormal IQ, was a frequent figure of ridicule and contempt among his peers, something that came as no surprise to Sagar when he met Lee in the flesh. He was not a normal young man. He was deformed. His right arm and his right leg were deformed. He had a limp. He had a habit of holding his right arm across his chest. He was poorly dressed. He was clearly undernourished, and on first impressions, one had to feel sorry for him. On the night of December 4th, Lee recalled, "One night I'm thinking I'm going to go to Charlie's house and set it on fire, give him a real frightener." He went on to tell Sagar how he took a container full of paraffin and stood in the shadows underneath the motorway flyover for a good time until it went real quiet. Then he described in detail walking up the path to the Hasty house, pouring the paraffin through the letterbox, and then, after 2 failed attempts to light matches, lit a piece of newspaper and pushed it through the letterbox to set the paraffin alight. This claim tallied with the newspaper, matches, and paraffin that were found at the scene. The details Lee knew about the fire convinced Sagar that this was no confession-happy attention seeker. The Hasty boy's murderer had been found. What they didn't know at that point was that this confession was not going to be Bruce Lee's last. When news broke that Hull police had arrested a young man named Bruce Lee for the Hasty murders, local mother Ross Fenton didn't recognize the name. However, she had followed developments in the case because a year earlier, in June 1979, she too had been involved in a house fire which she believed was started deliberately. After a neighbor had left her house and she prepared to go to bed, she saw a figure through the window of her front door who moved away when seen. She even thought she saw someone's hand poking through the mail slot, but wasn't alarmed. She thought she recognized the man as Daft Peter, a lad who lived nearby at the time and was regarded as something of a harmless halfwit, often seen around the area acting strangely. Mrs. Fenton went to bed, but was soon woken by people shouting, "Fire!" She immediately went into her 7-year-old daughter Samantha's bedroom to get her. But Mrs. Fenton was heavily pregnant at the time and struggled to find a way out of the blazing house. Finally, the smoke took its toll, and she and Samantha had to lie in the corner of the living room, hoping help would arrive in time. Both mother and child were rescued. They survived, but sustained severe burns. Mrs. Fenton also lost the baby she was carrying and spent several months in the hospital. She was too ill to make a witness statement to police, and because no one had died, there was no inquest, and the fire was blamed on an earlier visitor to the house dropping a cigarette on the carpet. Her sighting of Daft Peter went unreported. It was only when she saw a picture of Bruce Lee in the local paper that she realized that he and Daft Peter Dinsdale were actually the same person. She called police and told them of her suspicions, and when confronted about the fire, Lee admitted that he had broken into the house and set the place alight. When asked for a motive, he said, "I just did it. Someone I knew didn't like her, and, well, I just did it." When pressed further by Sagar, Lee admitted, "I like fires. I do. I like fires. He was asked if he was, in fact, a habitual fire raiser, who may even have killed more people in the past through starting fires. Sagar didn't expect a confession, but after a long pause, Lee responded, "Yes, you are right. I killed a little baby once." When asked for details of the baby he had killed, Bruce Lee told Sagar of a fire in West Dock Avenue, Hull, a couple of years back. "I just went in through a window one evening. I sprinkled paraffin on some carpet and the couch, the living room, I think it was, and up it went. The little baby died in it, and I killed her." On further investigation, it was found that just such a fire had occurred 3 years previously, on January 2nd, 1977. 6-month-old Katrina Thacker perished, but arson was never suspected. The day was a Sunday, and Karen Fraser had just been visited by her ex-husband, Pete Thacker, when the alarm was raised. She and Pete managed to rescue Fraser's 2 older daughters, aged 2 and 3, from the blaze with the help of firemen, but not baby Katrina. An inquest later concluded that a spark from the open fire must have started the fire. The fact that the then 16-year-old Lee had been among the onlookers as the fire was being put out was not noted at the time, nor was the fact that the fire had clearly spread very quickly, indicating an accelerant such as paraffin, and that the seat of the fire, around the furniture, suggested a spark from the fire could not have caused the blaze so quickly. It later emerged that Lee had been a frequent visitor to Pete Thacker's pigeon loft, often outstaying his welcome or walking into their house uninvited, leading to Thacker giving Lee a clip round the ear on one occasion only days before the fatal fire. After confessing to the West Dock Avenue fire, Lee soon went further. "I've done more," Sagar reports him admitting in his book Hull, Hell and Fire. "4 killed, even more. The 3 Hasties was my last one, but there's 4 other fires with 1 dead in each one." When Sagar visited Lee again in Leeds, where he was in prison on remand, he told them of yet more fatal fires. "There was a boy who went to my school," said Lee. "I killed him in a fire in his house a few years ago. That was a good while ago." Even more sensationally, he claimed responsibility for a blaze at an old people's home in 1977, which killed 11 elderly men. Scarcely able to believe what he was hearing, Sagar decided to test the veracity of Lee's confessions by putting him in a police car, driving him around the city of Hull, and challenging him to point out where these supposed arson attacks had taken place. If he was lying, his lack of knowledge about the fires would surely be telling. Lee took detectives to a large, partly demolished house to the west of the city, which had been Wensley Lodge's retirement home. It was gutted by fire on the night of the 5th of January 1977, a date which Lee noted himself was only 3 days after the West Dock Avenue fire. He told of how he had just come along here to do a big house, just ride along, any house. He cycled the 3 miles from his home to the house, painstakingly holding the can of paraffin on the handlebar of his bike. He said he picked the house because it was nice and quiet. He kicked a window through and poured paraffin on the floor of one of the rooms before cycling away and throwing his can of paraffin in the nearby River Humber. It was only when he read of the fire in the newspapers that he realized he had killed 11 men in an old bloke's home. Once again, however, arson was never suspected. Instead, the fire was blamed on a plumber who had been working with a blowtorch on a pipe in the boiler room beneath the seat of the fire earlier that afternoon. It was concluded that material had caught fire and smoldered for some 7 hours before building into a deadly conflagration around 9:30 p.m. If Lee's account was to be believed, he had committed one of Britain's worst mass murderers at the age of only 16. Yet only moments after providing corroboration to that claim, he directed Sagar to another house on Askew Avenue, Hull, where he claimed to have committed his first murder at the age of only 12. Lee had seen 6-year-old Richard Ellerington regularly, as he attended the same school for handicapped children, and Lee would often be on the school bus when it picked up Richard from outside his house. On the night of June 23, 1973, Samuel Ellerington and his wife Catherine were out for the evening, and a babysitter, Carol Dennett, had put their 6 children and her own baby to bed before the parents returned, and the 3 adults finally retired to bed at around 2:30 a.m. It was a warm evening, and the window was left open. The front door was also unlocked. Shortly before 7 a.m., the Elleringtons were awoken by smoke and raised the alarm, but by this time much of the house was ablaze. They managed to rescue 5 of their children, but were prevented by smoke and flames from reaching Richard, whose body was eventually found by firemen. When we stopped for the bus next morning, Lee told Sagar, they said he died in a fire during the night. I just sat on the bus quietly looking out a window and said nout. I've kept it secret from everybody for years. When asked why he had singled out this house to set it on fire, Lee could only say, no real reason. Whatever his motives or lack of them, though, by the time of this first murder, he was already addicted to starting fires. Peter Dinsdale was born in Manchester, England on July 31st, 1960. He never knew his father, who left his mother Doreen shortly before his birth, and when he was only 6 months old, his mother, who was working as a prostitute, sent him to live with his grandmother until he was 3. His mother had virtually disowned him by then and referred to him as the freak because of his disability and his occasional epileptic fits. He was left half the time running around outside, neighbor Hilda Lister told a TV documentary in 2002. She was no good. You don't neglect your kids as she did. He grew up with the kind of rock-bottom self-esteem that's common among arsonists. Nobody loved him, admitted Hilda Lister. Even the kids used to take the mickey out of him, or tease him. By the age of 9, young Peter's love affair with flames had already begun. He loved bonfires, and neighbor Sean Lister later recalled going with him to light a fire at a timber yard, which he later burnt down. At the same age, Lee also admitted starting a fire in a shopping precinct, which caused £17,000 or $30,000 worth of damage. Other contemporaries said he was frustrated at not being able to do the same things other children did, and later claimed his disability scuppered his ambition of being a trawlerman. He spent much of his teens in and out of care homes while his mother was either unable or unwilling to care for him. It was while there that he was introduced to homosexuality and the rent boy network in the local area. As a teenager, he worked at the local Speedway Stadium and the local pig market. A staff member at the stadium said, I used to feel sorry for him because the other lads would make fun of him. He never seemed to get upset. He seemed so quiet and unassuming and didn't stand out in a crowd. He would also babysit for local children in exchange for spending money, and on one occasion actually brought home a small black boy, claiming he was his son. While Daft Peter was rarely regarded as capable of anything spectacular, some believed that his daftness was often an act to help him fade into the background. Sometimes he would tell people he was a nobody, but then he would tell them they would never guess what he had been up to. As the hasty inquiry proved, he was entirely correct on that point. Throughout his teenage years, he started fires on a regular basis, over 30 that are known, and others which were either never reported or which he himself forgot about. What he lacked in conventional intelligence, he made up for in animal cunning. To use the phrase later coined by the prosecuting counsel in the case, Gerald Coles, in the way he covered his tracks after fires. After his arrest, he told Detective Superintendent Sagar, I know when I'm going to start a fire because my fingers tingle. While in prison awaiting trial, he regularly demanded access to Bibles and was interested in the Jehovah's Witness movement. He read Sagar a passage from Matthew 6:24, which said, No man may serve 2 masters. My master is fire, he concluded. The passage goes on to state that if a man did have 2 masters, he should despise one, but be devoted to the other. Lee told Sagar, I am devoted to fire and despise people. He especially hated people who had a home, he said, because he had never really had one. His mother, on the other hand, was typically unsympathetic. He just wanted to get in the headlines, she commented after his arrest. Between the time of his first confessed fatal fire in 1973 and the hasty fire in 1979, Lee would claim responsibility for no fewer than 26 deaths. A few months after he claimed the life of Richard Ellerington, in the early hours of October 12, 1973, the fire brigade was called to a house in Glasgow Street, Hull, where 72-year-old Arthur Smythe lived. He suffered from gangrene in both legs and led something of a reclusive existence. Lee had been walking the streets all night with a can of paraffin, with that familiar tingling in his fingers. Around 6 a.m., he found Smythe's house with a front window broken and climbed through it. He poured paraffin throughout the front room where the old man was sleeping, set it alight, and left through the front door. Smythe had little hope of escape and was dead by the time firemen gained access to the house. The inquest concluded that a faulty paraffin heater was to blame. A couple of weeks later, a fire broke out on the afternoon of October 27, 1973, at the home of 34-year-old David Brewer. He was unable to work due to an industrial injury, and he sat at home when the 13-year-old Lee struck. After getting up to go to the toilet, he returned to the living room to find the room ablaze. His clothes caught fire, and he ran out into the street screaming for help. But despite the help of neighbor Hilda Lister, he died from his burns. The neighbor later revealed that Lee had been involved in a row with Brewer and her son Sean Lister over the latter's pigeons. Lee threatened to kill Lister's pigeons, prompting Brewer to threaten him with a clout if he did. That was only a couple of days before the fire, and a couple of weeks later, most of Lister's pigeons were found dead with their necks wrung. Once again, however, arson was not suspected, and the blaze was eventually blamed on drying clothes catching light in front of the fire. It would be another year before Lee claimed his next victim. She was 82-year-old Elizabeth Rokar, a widow who lived on Rosamond Street, Hull, suffering from poor eyesight and only able to walk with a frame. By the time neighbors noticed smoke coming from her house just before 10 p.m., she had already died from smoke inhalation. The seat of the fire was found to be at the head of the bed, and the inquest verdict was misadventure, suggesting the old lady had been smoking in bed and allowed the sheets to catch fire. This, despite her family claiming she never smoked in bed. It would be 6 years before Lee admitted he gained entry to her house through the back door, which the old lady kept open to allow her cat access. In this case, as with the Ellerington and Smythe fires, there appeared to be no motive. There was another long gap before Lee's next major fire. On June 3, 1976, James and Veronica Edwards were out for the evening, and Mrs. Edwards' 77-year-old grandmother, Dorothy Stevenson, was looking after 3 of Mrs. Edwards' children. Mrs. Stevenson had just put the youngest child, 13-month-old Andrew, to bed when she came down the stairs to find smoke coming from the cupboard underneath the stairs. In the fire that ensued, baby Andrew was trapped upstairs and died. 5-year-old David Edwards claimed he had started the fire by playing with matches underneath the stairs, but Mrs. Stevenson insisted there were no matches in the house other than those she kept in her pocket. David later denied starting the fire, and his denial seemed convincing when Lee later admitted sneaking into the house and pouring paraffin underneath the stairs before setting the house alight. The end result, however, was yet another fire death which was wrongly filed as a tragic accident. A now all too familiar story unfolded after the West Dock Avenue and Wensley Lodge fires of January 1977, and after the 11 deaths at Wensley Lodge, the rate at which Lee was claiming innocent lives seemed to increase considerably. On April 27, 1977, Peter Jordan was awoken at around 3 a.m. while sleeping in the living room at his house of some friends, the Gold family. He heard a couple of bangs and saw a figure moving about. He then realized the room was on fire. Scrambling towards the stairs, he alerted his kids, who were sleeping upstairs with the Gold's 2 children, along with parents Albert and Gwendolyn Gold, in the front bedroom. The fire swept through the house rapidly, and although despite the brave efforts of Albert Gold, sustaining severe burns while trying to rescue the kids, 13-year-old Deborah Jordan and 7-year-old Mark Gold were trapped in the fire and died at the scene. The blame was eventually put on Peter Jordan for having a lit cigarette in the ashtray, which added horrendous feelings of guilt to his trauma at losing a son. The prospect of arson was never discussed, but when Lee admitted to entering the house by breaking a window and dousing the living room with petrol, Jordan would later admit that he couldn't understand how a window near the door had been broken. More young lives would be claimed by Lee the following year. In Reynoldson Street, Hull, on the morning of Friday, January 6th, mother of 4, Christine Dixon, had gone to the house of her next-door neighbor and close friend, Mrs. Kathleen Hartley, leaving her kids in the front room. She returned to find the front windows black with smoke and ran in and pulled out her baby, Brian, who was covered in black soot. She went back into the house for her other children, Mark 4, Stephen 3, and Michael 17 months. Then Mrs. Hartley was horrified to see a 4-foot ring of fire coming up from the living room carpet, as if the result of someone setting it alight. Then she heard Mrs. Dixon scream as an implosion enveloped her. She and her 3 sons didn't make it out alive, and the inquest put the blame on the children playing with lighter fluid that was on a shelf in the front room. Lee would tell a different story. The then 17-year-old youth lived nearby and said he was walking around that day with a washing-up liquid bottle filled with paraffin hidden under his jacket. He described feeling a tingling in his fingers and a fire in his head. Choosing the Dixons' house at random, he squirted the paraffin through the letterbox leading straight into the front room and threw lighted paper into it before quickly making his getaway. Incredibly, though, it would need a 10th fatal fire, making Lee Britain's most prolific serial killer, before he was suspected of setting fire to anything more serious than a cigarette. For someone of such low academic intelligence, Bruce Lee showed a particular cunning and ability to cover his tracks that belied his daft reputation. His ability to go unnoticed while loitering near the scenes of his crimes, despite being well known in the area, and to set fires in such a way that arson was never suspected, suggested a calculating criminal mastermind rather than a bumbling halfwit. Yet, when seen in context, the authorities' failure to identify arson as the cause of his fires is less surprising. Looking through copies of the Hull Daily Mail from the time, house fires made the headlines almost every other day, even after Lee's arrest. The houses were invariably in poor areas of the city, where open fires were still common in houses. Smoke alarms had yet to be common household appliances. Furniture was often made of cheap, highly flammable material, and smoking indoors was perfectly socially acceptable. So perhaps it was just cruel bad luck that meant the scenes of carnage Lee caused were for so long disregarded as commonplace household accidents. It was also Lee's good fortune that in the neighborhoods where he set the fires, relations between residents and police were not the best. After his trial, a TV documentary featured several local people who said they knew of Lee's habitual fire starting, but never mentioned it to police. One woman said she suspected Lee of starting the fire that killed David Brewer in October 1973, but decided, "You can't just go accusing, can you? You can't tell a policeman that a lad has started a fire." Meanwhile, since none of Lee's victims except the Hasties had the kind of enemies who could be considered willing or able to burn down their home, there seemed little cause to consider arson. It was only the Fenton and Hasty fires that Lee seemed noticeably careless in terms of covering his tracks. Indeed, it might be argued that his carelessness in committing those later crimes was evidence of a common serial killer trait, a seemingly unconscious desire to give himself away, which increases the longer his murderous activities continue. Either way, the spent matches he left outside the Hasties' gutted home on Selby Street and the paraffin he left on the ground were to bring a long overdue end to a 6-year reign of terror. After psychiatric evaluations, Bruce George Peter Lee was pronounced sane and fit to stand trial, and on January 20th, 1981, he pleaded not guilty at Leeds Crown Court to 26 counts of murder. Instead, he pleaded guilty to 26 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and 11 counts of arson, acknowledging recklessness as to whether life was endangered. Prosecuting counsel Gerald Coles said the Crown was preparing to accept his manslaughter pleas and said of Lee, "The fires were his only true achievement in life." Mr. Justice Tudor Evans recommended that Lee be detained in a maximum security mental hospital indefinitely for the protection of the public. Immediately after the verdict was announced, local members of Parliament called for a public inquiry into how Lee could have started these fires during periods when he was still a child in local authority care. However, back in 1981, the lack of notoriety didn't stop some sections of both the local and national press from casting doubt on Lee's guilt. The fact that the evidence and Lee's confessions had not been put under scrutiny in court in the same way as if he had pleaded not guilty meant certain questions appeared to go unanswered. The largest body of evidence challenging Lee's guilt was connected to the fire at Wensley Lodge Old People's Home in January 1977, which claimed the lives of 11 elderly men. The Sunday Times claimed that Lee's accounts of his movements that night did not tally with the known facts about the fire, and they also cast doubt on the ability of Lee, with a deformed hand, to ride a bike for 3 miles while holding a container full of paraffin, as he confessed to doing. To this day, Bruce George Peter Lee remains in a secure mental institution. Sagar has publicly stated that he hopes Lee will one day be deemed fit to be free, and makes good his pretrial assertion that, "I'll never set fire to another house as long as I live." However, it is highly unlikely that he will ever be released to test his promise.
On August 15, 1982, Robert Ainsworth, 41, stepped into his rubber raft and began his descent south down the Green River toward the outer edge of Seattle's city limits. It was a trip he had made on many occasions, yet this time it would be different. As he drifted slowly downstream, he noticed a middle-aged balding man standing by the riverbank and a second, younger man sitting in a nearby pickup truck. Ainsworth suspected that the men were out for a day's fishing. He asked the older man if he had caught anything. The man replied that he had not. According to Smith and Gullen's book, The Search for the Green River Killer, the man standing then asked Ainsworth if he found anything, to which Ainsworth replied, "Just this old singletree." Soon after, the two men left in the old pickup truck, and Ainsworth continued to float down the river. Moments later, he found himself surrounded by death. As he peered into the clear waters, his gaze was met by staring eyes. A young black woman's face was floating just beneath the surface of the water, her body swaying beneath her with the current. Believing it might be a mannequin, Ainsworth attempted to snag the figure with a pole. Accidentally, the raft overturned as he tried to dislodge the figure from a rock, and Ainsworth fell into the river. To his horror, he realized that the figure was not a mannequin, but a dead woman. Seconds later, he saw another floating corpse of a half-nude black woman, partially submerged in the water. Quickly, Ainsworth swam towards the riverbank where the truck stood earlier. In shock, he sat down and waited for help to arrive. Within a half hour, he noticed a man with 2 children on bicycles. He stopped them, told them of his gruesome discovery, and asked them to get the police. Before long, a policeman arrived at the scene and questioned Ainsworth about his find. The officer disbelievingly walked into the shallow river and reached out toward the ghostly form. The officer immediately called for backup. Soon after reinforcements arrived at the scene, detectives sealed off the area and began to search for evidence. During the search, a detective made another macabre discovery. He found a third body, that of a young girl who was partially clothed. Unlike the other 2 girls, this one was found in a grassy area less than 30 feet from where the other victims lay in the water. It was obvious that she had died from asphyxiation. The girl had a pair of blue pants knotted around her neck. She also showed signs of a struggle because she had bruises on her arms and legs. She was later identified as Opal Mills, 16. It was believed that she had been murdered within 24 hours of her discovery. Following an examination of the bodies at the scene, Chief Medical Examiner Donald Ray determined that all 3 girls died of strangulation. The 2 girls found in the water, later identified as Marcia Chapman, 31, and Cynthia Hines, 17, were both found to have pyramid-shaped rocks lodged in their vaginal cavities. They were both held down by rocks in the water. Ray further determined that Chapman, a mother of 2 who had gone missing 2 weeks earlier, had been dead for over a week. She had shown advanced signs of decomposition. However, Hines was believed to have been in the river for a period of only several days. The 3 bodies were not the only ones to be found in and around Washington State's Green River. Several days earlier, the body of a woman named Deborah Bonner was discovered. Her nude body had been found slumped over a log in the Green River. She, too, had been strangled to death. Just a month earlier, another young girl, identified as Wendy Lee Caulfield, was found strangled and floating in the Green River. Moreover, 6 months prior to Caulfield's discovery, the body of her friend, Leanne Wilcox, was found several miles from the river in an empty lot. It was not believed that the Green River killer murdered Wilcox. Within the space of 6 months, 6 bodies had been discovered in or near the river. The police detectives at the scene quickly realized that there was a serial killer on the loose. They knew that they had to find and catch him as soon as possible before any more women disappeared. A special task force was assembled of King County detectives to investigate the Green River murders. According to the Seattle Times, it was the largest police task force ever assembled since the Ted Bundy murders less than a decade earlier. Major Richard Kraske, the head of the Criminal Investigation Division, and Detective Dave Reichart of the King County Major Crime Squad led the team. They enlisted the help of FBI serial killer profile John Douglas and criminal investigator Bob Keppel, who was known for his unique and successful approach of compiling evidence in the Ted Bundy case 8 years earlier. The investigation got off to a shaky start because a massive influx of information swamped the police force within a relatively short period of time. They simply did not have the means to process the ever-increasing amount of data and evidence, and much of it was lost, misplaced, or overlooked entirely. In fact, the situation got so bad that at one point they enlisted the help of volunteers to assist the police in the ongoing investigation. During their investigation, detectives learned that many of the murdered girls knew each other and shared a similar history of prostitution. Investigators decided to begin their search for the killer in the area where the girls were known to frequent. They conducted hundreds of interviews with many prostitutes who worked the main strip in Seattle, stretching from South 139th Street to South 272nd Street. Investigators tried to obtain information on any suspicious characters they might have encountered. However, many of the girls were reluctant to talk because of their blatant mistrust for the police. One of the prostitutes who worked the strip filed a report with police, stating that a man who raped her made reference to the Green River murders. Soon after the report, the task force began to search for the assailant. On August 20, 1982, the police announced that they had him in custody as a potential suspect in the Green River murders. However, they were unable to find any plausible evidence connecting him with the crime. He was eventually released, and the search resumed for the killer. There were other prostitutes who filed reports with the police that were of special concern to the task force. It was believed that the reports could be related to the Green River murders. Interviews taken by two separate prostitutes claimed that a man in a blue and white truck abducted them and attempted to kill them. According to one account by Susan Widmark, 21, a middle-aged man in a blue and white truck solicited her. Once Widmark was in his truck, he pointed a pistol to her head and sped off toward the highway. He took her to a desolate road, turned off the engine, and proceeded to violently rape her. Following the rape, he allowed her to dress while he began to drive away from the scene with her still in the car. While driving, he made reference to the recent river murders, while continuing to hold a gun to her head. Fearing for her life, she managed to escape from the vehicle while at a stoplight. Widmark was able to make out part of the registration number of the truck before the man sped away. A similar incident happened to Deborah Estes, 15, who filed a report with police in late August 1982 concerning a rape. Estes told police that she was walking down the highway when a man in a blue and white pickup truck approached her and offered her a ride. She accepted and climbed into the vehicle. To her amazement, the man pulled a pistol out and pointed it at her head. He violently forced her to give him oral sex before releasing her into the woods, handcuffed and driving off. She immediately fled the scene, looking for help. Seeing an emerging pattern that could have been related to the Green River murders, the task force decided to follow the lead and search for the truck and driver. They hoped that new information concerning the man would lead them to a break in the case. That September, a meat butcher named Charles Clinton Clark was pulled over in his blue and white truck while driving along Seattle's main strip. After a background check was conducted, it was learned that Clark owned 2 handguns. Investigators believed that Clark might be the man they were looking for. They obtained his driver's license photo and showed it to both Widmark and Estes. Both women positively identified Clark as their attacker. Clark was arrested and his house and vehicle were searched. The police found 2 handguns that were allegedly used in the assaults. After interrogation by police, Clark admitted to attacking the women. However, there was speculation as to whether he was the Green River killer because he was known to release his victims following an attack. Moreover, Clark had a solid alibi during the time many of the Green River victims disappeared. When Clark was being booked with the rape of Widmark and Estes, 19-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan disappeared during a walk. Meehan was more than 8 months pregnant and went missing near the Western Six Motel. The motel was located on the Strip and was a frequent hangout and workplace for many of the prostitutes that fell victim to the Green River killer. Based on a hunch, Detective Reichert began to suspect that one of the volunteer civilians working on the case might be the Green River killer. A 44-year-old out-of-work taxi driver became the focus of the investigation and was vigorously interviewed by the police. They were concerned because 2 weeks prior to Meehan's disappearance, 2 16-year-old girls, Kaysan Lee and Terry Renee Milligan, mysteriously disappeared. They too were thought to have a history of prostitution. It was suspected that they had fallen victim to the Green River killer. The taxi driver seemed to fit the profile of the killer devised by FBI agent John Douglas. According to Douglas, the Green River Killer was a confident yet impulsive middle-aged man who would most likely frequent the murder scenes in order to reenact the crimes in his mind. The killer was probably familiar with the area and was likely to have deep religious convictions. Moreover, Douglas believed that he might have an active interest in police work, especially the investigation into the recent murders. The killer might even contact the police in an effort to assist in the ongoing investigation. During most of the winter of 1982, police heavily monitored the taxi driver's movements, although he continuously denied having anything to do with the Green River murders. The taxi driver eventually became the primary suspect in the killings. He was arrested for unpaid parking tickets because investigators had no solid evidence connecting him to the murders, except that he knew 5 of the victims. On September 26, 1982, the decomposing remains of a 17-year-old prostitute named Giselle A. Lavorne were discovered. She had gone missing for more than 2 months before a biker found her nude body near abandoned houses south of the SeaTac International Airport. She had been strangled to death by a pair of men's black socks. Intriguingly, at the time of her disappearance, she was blonde, yet when her body was discovered, her hair was dyed black. Although her body was not found in the direct vicinity of the now infamous river, police believe that she was a victim of the Green River Killer. Between September 1982 and April 1983, approximately 14 girls disappeared. Those missing included Mary Meehan, Deborah Estes, Denise Bush, Shwanda Summers, Shirley Sherrill, Rebecca Marrero, Colleen Brockman, Alma Smith, Dolores Williams, Gail Matthews, Andrea Childers, Sandra Gabbert, Kimi Kai Pitsor, and Marie Malvar. Most of the girls, ages ranging from between 15 and 23 years old, were known prostitutes who frequented the strip. The Green River Task Force's attention was temporarily drawn to one possible suspect allegedly involved in the disappearance of the last girl to go missing, Marie Malvar. On April 30th, 1983, Malvar's boyfriend saw her talking with a potential customer in a dark-colored truck as she was soliciting on the strip. The boyfriend claimed that he saw Malvar get into the truck before it sped away. According to Smith and Gullen, Malvar's boyfriend stated that Malvar and the unknown man seemed to be engaged in an argument. Suspicious of the driver of the truck, the boyfriend followed them. Before long, the truck with his girlfriend in it gave chase and eventually disappeared when the boyfriend was held up by a stoplight. It was the last time he ever saw his girlfriend. He later notified the police of Malvar's disappearance. Less than a week after the incident, he, along with Malvar's father and brother, spotted the suspicious truck near the place where he initially lost sight of it days earlier. They followed the truck to a house located on South 348th Street and called the police. The police eventually arrived at the house and spoke with the owner, Gary Ridgway, who denied having ever seen Malvar. Satisfied, the police left the residence and failed to pursue the matter any further. A similar truck to that owned by Ridgway was also involved in the April disappearance of a young prostitute named Kimi Kai Pitsor. While in the process of turning a trick, Pitsor's pimp saw her getting into a dark green pickup truck with an attached camper. He described the driver of the vehicle as having a pockmarked face. He watched as the two drove off and he never saw Pitsor again. He later informed police, but the information concerning Pitsor's disappearance and Malvar's was never fully connected. By the spring of 1983, the investigation into the Green River Killer and related murders was collapsing. The task force detectives realized that the probability of the taxi driver being the killer was low, yet they continued to keep him as a prime suspect. They had no new leads, and prostitutes continued to rapidly disappear throughout the city. Inundated with an avalanche of tips, the task force was unable to keep up with a massive influx of information. They enlisted the help of Bob Keppel to help organize the mountain of information. In late April, Keppel spent 3 months going through all the information available pertaining to the murders believed to have been attributed to the Green River Killer. Upon completion of his analysis, he compiled a report for the sheriff of King County, Vern Thomas. To the task force's dismay, the report was highly critical of the ongoing investigation. According to Keppel in his book The Riverman, if the killer was to be found, many changes needed to be made. The report compiled by Keppel stated that most of the data, including evidence, files, and witness accounts connected to the crimes, were in total disarray. The first thing that was needed was a complete reorganization and accurate categorization of all the data. Then, once that was completed, similarities and dissimilarities among the cases needed to be identified in order to find common threads, possibly connecting the murders to one or more killers. There was no doubt that a successful and thorough investigation would cost the county a lot more time and money than they previously expected. Already, the investigation was the largest operation in the history of the country. The amount of money needed to implement Keppel's suggestions would far exceed the estimated $2 million. However, something needed to be done in an effort to stop the murderous rampages of the killer. On May 8, 1983, another body was discovered that was later identified as Carol Ann Christensen, 21. Her remains were found by a family hunting for mushrooms in a wooded area near Maple Valley. When Christensen's body was found, the killer displayed her corpse in an unusually gruesome way. Christensen was found with her head covered by a brown paper bag. When it was removed, it was found that she had a fish carefully placed on top of her neck. Smith and Gullen state that the killer also placed another fish on her left breast and a bottle between her legs. Her hands were placed crossed over her stomach, and freshly ground beef was placed on top of her left hand. Further examination revealed that she was strangled with a cord. Intriguingly, she also showed signs of having been in water at some point, even though the river was miles away. The task force speculated that she was yet another victim of the Green River Killer. During the spring and summer of 1983, 9 more young women, many of whom were prostitutes, disappeared. Those missing included Martina Otherly and Cheryl Lee Wims, 18, Yvonne Antosh, 19, Carrie Royce, 15, Constance Naon, 21, Tammy Lillies, 16, Kelly McGinnis, 18, Tina Thompson, 22, and April Buttram, 17. A majority of the girls were placed on the ever-growing list of possible Green River Killer murders. However, there were some who did not make the list because they were found outside of the parameters where the Green River Killer was known to dump many of the bodies. That summer, several more bodies were discovered. In June, the unidentified remains, which were believed to be of a 17 to 19-year-old white woman, was found on Southwest Tualatin Road. On August 11th, the body of missing Shonda Summers was discovered near the SeaTac airport. One day later, the remains of another body, which remained unidentified, was found at the SeaTac Airport North site. The fall and winter of 1983 would also yield as many disappearances and even more corpses. Between September and December of 1983, 9 more women went missing and 7 bodies were discovered, all of whom were believed to have been abducted and murdered by the Green River Killer. The missing women, who were mostly prostitutes, included Debbie Abernathy, 26, Tracy Ann Winston, 18, Patricia Osborne and Maureen Feeney, Mary Sue Bello, 25, Pammy Avent, 16, Delise Plaisir, 22, Kim Nelson, 26, and Lisa Lorraine Yates. Those whose bodies were discovered included Dolores Williams, 17, who had gone missing March 8, 1983. Her remains were discovered on September 18th at Star Lake. That same day, the remains of Gail Matthews, 23, were also discovered at Star Lake. Over the next few months, the bodies of 5 more women were discovered. On October 15th, the skeletal remains of Yvonne Antosh, who was last seen on May 31st, was found near Sue's Creek on Auburn Black Diamond Road. She was one of the few victims to have had a missing persons report filed on her. 12 days later, the partially buried skeleton of Constance Naon was found in an area south of SeaTac Airport. The task force investigators believed that there were probably more bodies to be found in that area, so they decided to conduct a search with the assistance of a team of teenaged explorer Boy Scouts. On October 29th, during a sweep of the empty lots surrounding the airport, one of the scouts found a skeleton covered with trash beneath some bushes. The remains were later identified as Kelly Ware, 22. The killer's deadly rampage claimed 2 more victims whose bodies were discovered before the new year. On November 13th, following an extensive search of several lots surrounding an area south of SeaTac near South 192nd Street, the badly decomposed remains of Mary Meehan and her unborn baby were found. According to the Cold Cereal website, Meehan and her child were the only victims attributed to the Green River Killer who were fully buried. Several unexplainable items were found on or close to the body, including 2 small pieces of plastic, a large clump of hair near the pubic region of the body, a patch of skin attached to the skull, which contained fibers on it, 3 small bones, 2 halved yellow pencils, and clear plastic tubing. 1 month later, on December 15th, the skull of Kimi Kai Pitsor was found in Auburn, Washington, near Mountain View Cemetery. It seemed as if the killer found a new burial site to place his victims. It would be the fifth known dumping ground used for the disposal of the bodies. 2 weeks following Pitzer's discovery, the Green River Task Force increased by more than half due to the increasing numbers of murders in the area. It was feared many more murders would occur in the coming months. Their predictions would prove to be correct. Although the official count of Green River victims was estimated at the time to be 11 or 12, the number has been and continues to be challenged. The precise number to this day remains unclear, and it's believed to be much higher than initially estimated. Near the final months of 1983, there were approximately 18 bodies discovered in the Seattle region. Many victims were not included on the list, even though they were killed in very nearly the same fashion as the other victims. There was no explanation given as to why the women were excluded from the list. In January 1984, the Green River Task Force came under new leadership headed by Captain Frank Adamson, who previously headed the police department's Internal Affairs Unit. During the first few months of Adamson's assignment, drastic changes took place. He first decided that it would be in the investigation's best interest to relocate the task force headquarters to the Burien County precinct, which was near the airport and closer to where the crimes were occurring. Following Keppel's advice, Adamson divided up various tasks and assigned them to individuals within the team. It was believed that this method would facilitate a more thorough organization, integration, and assemblage of the vast amounts of information and lead to more successful results in the case. Smith and Gullen stated that one team composed of 7 investigators and 1 sergeant team leader was assigned to handle the victims of the Green River killer. Another team of similar construction was assigned to information pertaining to probable suspects. Adamson then assigned 3 detectives to a newly constructed crime analysis section, whose duties involved the follow-up of leads and analysis of possible trends and methodologies utilized by the killer, as well as other pertinent information relevant to the case. 22 police officers were also assigned to the task force's Protect Proactive Squad, which developed new strategies to monitor prostitute activities on the Strip and any unusual events or dealings in the area. Moreover, a new strategy was imposed by Keppel that changed the investigators' focus from a suspect's possible guilt to the suspect's possible innocence. The implication of this strategy allowed investigators to quickly eliminate people under suspicion who had alibis and instead concentrate on more probable suspects. The suspects that remained were prioritized according to their threat. Those that were most closely linked to victims, fit the profile of the killer, and his movements were put in Category A. Those who were less closely linked with the crimes were assigned to Categories B or C before being eventually eliminated. Just when it seemed as if the newly revised task force was better prepared to capture the Green River killer, the inevitable occurred. On February 14, 1984, the skeletal remains of a woman who was later identified as Denise Louise Plager were discovered 40 miles from the city close to Interstate 90. She was the first victim to be found that year, but not the last. Over the next 2 months, approximately 9 more bodies would be found. Some of those found included those of Cheryl Wims, 18, Lisa Yates, 26, Debbie Abernathy, Terry Milligan, 16, Sandra Gabbert, 17, and Alma Smith, 22. The other victims remained unidentified. Most of the girls had one primary thing in common: a history of prostitution. Although it appeared as if the Green River Task Force was making few advances in the investigation, distinct patterns began to emerge that allowed the team to create a more accurate profile of the killer and his movements. The killer seemed to have several dumping grounds where he would dispose of the bodies of his victims. With the exception of Meehan, the bodies that were discovered were found partially buried or covered with garbage or foliage. Most of the bodies had been found off isolated roads in or near illegal waste dumping areas. The FBI's profiler, John Douglas, concluded that the bodies were dumped in the areas because the killer thought of the women as human garbage. During 1983, dumping grounds moved away from the river and concentrated mostly around the SeaTac Airport and Star Lake. In 1984, the victims' remains were concentrated in the areas of Mountain View Cemetery and North Bend, off of or near to Interstate 90. The victims were also disappearing from 2 primary areas, the Strip and the downtown area of Seattle. The task force worked under the assumption that the killer worked or lived close to the area where he was disposing the bodies. The task force determined that the areas where the bodies were found, when plotted on a map, roughly formed a triangular shape. It was believed that the killer might live somewhere within that triangle. An important discovery was also made in April when the skeletal remains of some of the victims were found. Shoe impressions, possibly that of the killer, were revealed when investigators removed the brush that partially concealed the bodies. Upon examination of the prints, investigators learned that they were made by a size 10 or 11 man's walking shoe. It was a vital piece of evidence that could connect the killer with his victims. In mid-April, a volunteer task force worker and psychic, Barbara Cubic Pattern, had a vision that another woman's body would be found close to Interstate 90. Cubic Pattern immediately contacted the police and told them about her vision, but became increasingly frustrated when they failed to act on the new information. Taking matters into her own hands, she and her daughter set out to find the woman. Following the leads revealed by her vision, Cubic Pattern and her daughter eventually came across another body. Immediately after the discovery, the two women drove to a nearby search area that was paroled by the police. When she informed one of the officers of her discovery, she was rebuffed and even threatened with arrest for obstruction of the guarded perimeter. Angered, Cubic Pattern informed reporters that were stationed nearby of her discovery. Finally, members of the task force approached her as she talked with the reporters and asked her to show them the body. Shortly thereafter, the police were confronted with a gruesome discovery. The decomposing remains were that of Amina Agashev, 36. She was last seen on July 7, 1982, at a restaurant in downtown Seattle. Agashev did not fit the description of many of the other victims. She was older than the other victims and a waitress, not a prostitute. Agashev was also in a stable relationship at the time of her disappearance and was a mother of two. Although there were obvious differences between Agashev's lifestyle and those of the other victims and the location of where her body was disposed, investigators believed that she was the victim of the Green River Killer. Moreover, she was listed as one of the killer's first victims, even though several murders prior to her disappearance matched the MO of the killer. On May 26, two children playing on Jovita Road in Pierce County were shocked when they discovered a skeleton. The police and task force were immediately alerted to the new finding. Following a medical examination, it was discovered that the remains were that of 15-year-old runaway Colleen Brockman. Investigators still had no leads to the identity of the killer, apart from the location of the bodies and the shoe print. After almost 3 years, the murderous killing spree continued. Following the discovery of Brockman, the rash of murders seemed to be diminishing. However, the desire to catch the killer remained a top priority for the task force. In August 1984, investigators believed their big break in the case arrived when two criminals in a San Francisco jail confessed to the Green River murders. After extensive interviews with the two prisoners, the confessions were determined to be a hoax. Several months later, the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy offered from his prison cell on death row to assist Keppel on the task force in finding their man. Bundy offered his old antagonist a rare glimpse into the mind of a serial killer, an offer that Keppel could not refuse. The two men conversed mostly via letters, where Keppel asked detailed questions that he hoped Bundy could answer. Much of the information that Keppel received greatly interested Keppel and the task force investigators. Bundy suggested that the killer knew his victims, probably even befriending them before he lured them to their deaths. According to Keppel's book, The Riverman, Bundy suggested that the killer likely disposed of even more bodies where they found the most recent ones. Moreover, he believed the disposal pattern of the bodies led closer to the killer's home. Bundy was able to give unusual insight from a killer's perspective, much of which was helpful to the case. The information received from Bundy assisted the detectives in their general understanding of serial killer behavior. In fact, Bundy became one of the primary consultants, next to Douglas and Keppel, that contributed to the build-up of the killer's profile. Despite this unusual advice, the task force remained stymied as to the identity of the Green River Killer. Although the murders seemed to have slowly diminished, they did not cease altogether. Between October and December 1984, two more bodies, identified as Mary Sue Bello, 25, and Martina Otherly, 18, were discovered. Both bodies were found off of Highway 410. The total body count had climbed to 31, although only 28 of the victims actually made it on the ever-growing official Green River murder list. 14 women were still believed to be missing. On March 10, 1985, another partially buried body was found near Star Lake Road. The victim was eventually identified as Carrie Ross, 15. She disappeared during the summer of 1983. In mid-June, a man bulldozing a patch of land in Tigard, Oregon, discovered the skeletal remains of two more women. The remains were later identified as Denise Bush, 23, and Shirley Sherrill, 19. Both girls were known prostitutes in Seattle. The discovery of the two women confirmed the fact that the Green River killer's parameters had extended out of state. It seemed as if a new dumping ground had been revealed. Meanwhile, FBI profiler John Douglas reevaluated the previous profile of the killer and came to a new conclusion that there were two separate killers. Douglas suggested that, although the profiles of both killers were similar in many ways, the way in which they disposed of the bodies slightly differed. To Douglas, it seemed as if one of the killers went to greater effort to conceal the bodies than the other. Whereas some of the bodies were partially covered or buried in isolated areas, other bodies lay openly exposed to detection, such as those found in the Green River. Although the theory seemed to be plausible, there were no suspects available that could support his theory. The case had run cold, and no likely suspects could be connected with any of the murders. Pressure mounted on the task force for its inability to capture the killer, or killers, after more than 3 years. It was not until the winter that the skeletal remains of yet 3 more victims were found. The first remains were identified as those belonging to Mary West, which were found in a wooded area in Seward Park in Seattle. The other 2 remains were that of Kimikai Pitsor and another unidentified white female between 14 and 19 years old. The unusual aspect of this more recent discovery was that Pitsor's remains had been located in 2 different locations. In December 1983, her skull was discovered in Mountain View Cemetery, and 2 years later, the remainder of her body was found a short distance away in a ravine. It could have been possible that an animal dragged the skull from the body sometime after death. However, there was no evidence that this occurred. The police believed it was the work of the killer. Investigators were uncertain as to the killer's motive for dividing the body between the 2 different locations. They speculated that it was done to taunt the police or confuse the investigation. In February 1986, the Green River Task Force seemed to get the break it had been hoping for. A man described by investigators as a person of interest was brought into the police station and searched. The event received a great deal of media attention. An FBI agent and Detective Jim Doyton of the task force extensively questioned the new suspect. However, before long, they realized he was not the man they were looking for. Shortly thereafter, the man was released. During this time, the public became increasingly aware of the task force's lack of results. Thus far, there had been several suspects taken into custody, and each one proved to have no connection with the murders. Public anger and fear reached a boiling point. The media referred to the Green River Task Force as a joke. To make matters worse, that summer, the skeletal remains of 3 more women were discovered off of I-90 east of Seattle. The remains were those of Maureen Feeney, 19, Kim Nelson, 26, and another unidentifiable young woman. Feeney was the only one of the 3 that investigators were able to link to a career in prostitution. The number of victims was quickly climbing towards a staggering 40. By the end of 1986, the staff had been reduced by 40%, and Adamson was reassigned to another project. Captain James Pompey became the new leader of the Green River Task Force. Pompey immediately began to reorganize the team and the data related to the investigation. Just as Pompey was beginning to get started, 2 more bodies were discovered in December. This time, the bodies were found much further away than expected, in an area north of Vancouver, British Columbia. Yet again, the killer seemed to be taunting investigators. Even more intriguing was that the partial remains of several other women had been scattered alongside the bodies of the 2 women. Even though the bodies were located a great distance from the others, there was no doubt in the investigators' minds that the work was that of the Green River killer. In the beginning months of 1987, investigators had a new suspect in relation to the Green River murders. Previously known to police, the newest suspect had been picked up for attempting to solicit an undercover police officer posing as a prostitute in May 1984. However, the man was released after he successfully passed a lie detector test. When investigators looked deeper into the man's past, they discovered that he had been accused of choking a prostitute in 1980 near the SeaTac International Airport. Yet, the man pleaded self-defense after claiming the woman bit him, and he was soon after released from police custody. One of the task force detectives, Matt Haney, was highly suspicious of this suspect and decided to dive even further into the man's history. He discovered that the police had at one time stopped and questioned the man back in 1982 when he was in his truck with a prostitute. The investigator learned that the prostitute he was with was one of the women on the Green River murder list, Kelly McGinnis. Moreover, the police approached the man again in 1983 in connection with the kidnapping of murder victim Marie Malvar. A witness, Malvar's boyfriend, followed the truck to the suspect's house after recognizing it as the one he had last saw his girlfriend in. Haney believed he might be on to the Green River Killer. Haney learned from the man's ex-wife that he often frequented the dump sites where many of the bodies had been discovered. Also, several prostitutes claimed to have seen a man matching the suspect's description regularly cruising the strip between 1982 and 1983. It turned out that the man passed the strip almost daily on his way to work. Some of the most damning evidence discovered was that the man, who worked as a truck painter, was found to have been absent or off duty on every occasion a victim disappeared. Finally, on April 8, 1987, the police obtained a warrant and searched the man's house. According to the Seattle Times, the police also took bodily samples of the suspect so that they could compare them with the evidence they had from the Green River victims. However, there was insufficient evidence to arrest him, and the man was released from police custody. The suspect was identified as Gary Ridgway. Several weeks following Ridgway's release, Captain Pompey died from a massive heart attack related to a scuba diving accident. The unfortunate event was picked up by the media and sensationalized. It was suggested that the Green River Killer was actually a police officer that murdered Pompey, regardless of the fact that there was absolutely no substantiating evidence to support the theory. One newspaper even called for an official investigation into the death of Pompey. It seemed as if the public's nerves had become so raw after so much death in the city. The task force, which was now led by Captain Greg Boyle, was called once again in June. 3 boys stumbled across the partially buried skeletal remains of a young woman while searching for aluminum cans. The girl, who was identified as Cindy Ann Smith, 17, was found in a ravine behind the Green River Community College. She had been missing for approximately 3 years before her discovery. More bodies of missing young women were discovered in the year that followed, some of which included that of missing runaway Debbie Gonzalez, 14, and Deborah Estes, 15, who disappeared 6 years earlier. Their deaths were attributed to the Green River Killer. Although there were still bodies being discovered, there were no recent killings attributed to the Green River Killer in the Seattle region. In 1988, the discovery of more than 20 bodies of prostitutes in San Diego led to the belief that the Green River Killer moved and continued his murderous rampage in California. Detective Reichert and the new task force commander Bob Evans temporarily joined forces with the San Diego Police Department in an effort to find the killer. In December 1988, investigators had a new suspect. A man named William J. Stevens caught the attention of the police after several callers phoned him in as a potential suspect during the airing of the popular true crime detective show Crime Stoppers. Stevens was a prison escapee who was on the run for 8 years after a 2-year stint behind bars for burglary. At the time he was rediscovered by police, he was enrolled at the University of Washington as a pharmacology student. As task force investigators delved into Stevens's past, they learned that he was already a suspect in the Green River killings. It was also learned that Stevens had a blatant contempt for prostitutes and was known to have, on several occasions, talked about murdering them. When police searched his home, they found masses of firearms, several driver's licenses, credit cards and assumed names, and sexually explicit nude photos of prostitutes. Stevens was highly involved in robbery and credit card fraud, which he used to survive. Task force investigators exhaustively interviewed Stevens about the Green River murders and searched the premises of his home throughout the summer and fall of 1989. Investigators even searched Stevens's father's home for clues tying him to any of the murders. However, nothing was found linking him to the murders. Moreover, credit card records and photographs produced by Stevens's brother provided a tight alibi against his involvement with the crimes. According to the numerous records and receipts, Stevens was traveling across the country during the summer months of 1982 when many of the murders occurred. Eventually, Stevens was cleared of all involvement in the Green River murders. In October 1989, 2 more skeletal remains of young women were found. One of the victims, identified as Andrea Childers, was found in a vacant lot near Star Lake and 55th Avenue South. Like many of the young women found before her, the cause of death remained unclear due to the state of decomposition. In early 1990, the skull of Denise Bush was found in a wooded area in Southgate Park in Tukwila, Washington. The remainder of Bush's body was located in Oregon 5 years earlier. Once again, it seemed as if the killer was purposefully moving the bones around in an effort to confuse investigators. Task force investigators were beginning to believe that the killer had defeated them. morale among the officers was at an all-time low. According to the Seattle Times, in July 1991, the task force was reduced to just one investigator named Tom Jensen. After 9 years, roughly 49 victims, and $15 million, the task force still had not caught the Green River Killer. The investigation became known as the country's largest unsolved murder case. The case remained dormant for 10 years. In April 2001, almost 20 years after the first known Green River murder, Detective Reichart, who had become the sheriff of King County, began renewed investigations into the murders. It was a case he refused to let go of, and he remained determined to find the killer. This time, the task force had technology on their side. Reichart formed a new task force team, initially consisting of 6 members, including DNA and forensic experts and a couple of detectives. It wasn't long before the force grew to more than 30 people. All the evidence from the murder examination was re-examined, and some of the forensic samples were sent to the labs. The first samples to be sent to the lab were found with 3 victims that were murdered between 1982 and 1983: Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Carol Christensen. The samples consisted of semen supposedly taken from the killer. The semen samples underwent a newly developed DNA testing method and were compared with samples taken from Ridgway in April 1987. On September 10, 2001, Reichart received news from the labs that reduced the hardened detective to tears. There was a match found between the semen samples taken from the victims and Ridgway. On November 30th, Ridgway was intercepted by investigators on his way home from work and arrested on 4 counts of aggravated murder. The charges included that of the 3 girls and also Cynthia Hines, in which circumstantial evidence was also found connecting him with her death. The man that investigators had sought for 20 years was finally in police custody. This time, they wouldn't let him go. Ridgway, originally born in Salt Lake City, Utah on February 18, 1949, worked for a computer company at the time of his arrest. During the time of the murders, he was employed as a truck painter for 30 years at the Kentworth Truck Factory in Renton, Washington. Ridgway owned many trucks during that time, one of which was of special interest to investigators. According to Seattle's King 5 television station, a 1977 black Ford F-150 owned by the suspect allegedly was connected with some of the victims. According to Time magazine's Terry McCarthy, Ridgway had an unusual sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several old girlfriends told the reporter that he was sexually insatiable, demanding sex several times a day. Oftentimes, he would want to have sex in a public area or in the woods, even in the areas where some of the bodies had been discovered. Ridgway was also known to have been obsessed with prostitutes, a fixation that bordered on a love-hate relationship. Neighbors knew him to constantly complain about prostitutes conducting business in his neighborhood, but at the same time, he frequently took advantage of their favors. It was possible that he was torn by his uncontrollable lusts and his staunch religious beliefs. McCarthy states that according to one of his wives, he became a religious fanatic, oftentimes crying following sermons and reading the Bible. Evidence continued to be gathered from Ridgway in connection with the Green River murder case. Although he pleaded not guilty on all counts in the preliminary hearings, it was suspected that evidence would prove otherwise. Ridgway's attorney, Tom Savage, expected a trial sometime in 2004. Prosecutors intended to seek the death penalty. Ridgway remained interned in jail, awaiting his fate. Millions around the world waited for one question to be answered: is Ridgway the only Green River killer? On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway, 54, avoided the death penalty in King County, Washington, by confessing to the murders of 48 women, most of whom were murdered in the 1982-84 timeframe. The deal Ridgway made was to cooperate with authorities on closing these cases in exchange for 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole. His formal sentencing occurred in January of 2004. However, because some of the victims were buried and possibly killed in Oregon and other areas outside King County, Ridgway could face the death penalty in other jurisdictions. Families of the victims are angry. They had been led to believe that the prosecutors would seek the death penalty, but instead, capital punishment was plea bargained away. Also, legal scholars are wondering about whether this case signals the end of the death penalty in Washington state. If a man who premeditatedly murdered 48 women doesn't get the death penalty, then who is eligible for it? A typical psychopath, Ridgway forgot his victims, had a hard time keeping them straight, never learned their names, and wrote them off as a vicarious thrill, never personalizing them at all. They were throwaways to Ridgway, disposable women. I killed some of them outside. I remember leaving each woman's body in the place where she was found, he said. I killed most of them in my house near Military Road, and I killed a lot of them in my truck not far from where I picked them up. He claims that they were all killed in King County, hoping that prosecutors outside King County will buy it and not prosecute him. Ridgway's contempt for women in general, and prostitutes in particular, was clear in his plea bargain statement. I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate most prostitutes, and I did not want to pay them for sex. I also picked prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. Ridgway exhibited typical serial killer behavior when he expressed his interest in reliving the murder experience, which gave him the sense of empowerment that he lacked in his everyday life. He buried his victims in clusters so that he could drive by and remember the cluster and the pleasure he experienced in the murders of those victims. King County officials wanted to create the impression that this plea bargain brings closure to the case. But it did not. There was something a bit fishy here. We are led to believe that Ridgway went into a killing frenzy in the 1982-84 period and then stopped completely until he murdered once more in 1990 and then once again in 1998. Unfortunately, that is not usually what happens in the world of a serial killer. They can slow down, especially when there's a great deal of police activity, but not really stop. Are we to believe that he really went so long without killing after 1984 when he killed some 46 women in just a few years? Our expectation is that there were many more victims buried within and outside of King County. It took many years to find the bodies that were part of this plea bargain. It may take many more years to find the rest of them. It's not really over yet.
In Stoneburg, Texas, on July 11, 1983, a drifter named Henry Lee Lucas was arrested for the illegal possession of a firearm. As a convicted felon, he wasn't allowed to have one. Lucas was 46 at the time and a suspect in the case of 2 missing women, but thus far, the leads were tenuous. Investigators were relieved to be able to lock him up for even a minor infraction because they figured that once he was in custody, they could get him to talk about the women he'd known. Kate Rich, 82, and Becky Powell, just a girl at 15, had been Lucas's companion. Witnesses had seen him with Kate on the day she disappeared. The one-eyed drifter just looked like bad news waiting to happen. At the very least, he should be able to tell them why Becky was no longer with him. Lucas was not happy about being locked up, especially because it kept him from coffee and cigarettes. He said that he'd been on the verge of helping to find Kate, but now they could do without his assistance. He was placed in a small cell in the Montague County Jail. Lucas claimed later, probably lying, that the police had treated him badly, stripping him, denying him cigarettes, holding him in a substandard cell, and prohibiting his contact with an attorney. He'd endured it for a period of 4 days and then decided to get their attention. While talking with one of the jailers, Joe Don, Lucas admitted that he'd done some bad things. As if to mitigate it, he said that he'd tried and failed to get help. "I've killed for the past 10 years, he confessed, and no one will believe me. Clearly, he was ready to talk, so investigators were positive that they'd soon have the information they needed to wrap up these 2 cases. Indeed, they did, and then some. Lucas's story is told in 2 full-length books, The Confessions of Henry Lee Lucas by Mike Cox and Hands of Death by Max Call, although Call apparently believed everything that Lucas said, which, in light of the details following, makes his book less than credible. Lucas has also been featured in several television documentaries, such as A&E's Myth of a Serial Killer and the 1986 movie Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which was recently released in a 20th anniversary edition. The Road, a 1988 play by David Earl Jones, was also based on stories Lucas told. After admitting that he killed, Lucas was charged with the murders of Kate Rich and Frida Becky Powell. He gave the authorities plenty of evidence, including the decomposed pieces of Becky, and at his June 21st arraignment in the Montague County courtroom, Lucas stated that he'd stabbed Kate Rich to death. But then he went on, waiving his right to an attorney, to say that he'd had sex with a body, cut it into pieces, and burned it in a wood stove behind his cabin. "I killed Kate Rich," he told a courtroom full of curious cops and reporters, and at least 100 more. The reaction was a stunned silence. 100! Either this guy was an out-and-out liar, or he was about to officially become the most proficient serial killer in American history. The judge asked Lucas if he'd ever been diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and he said he hadn't. He was lying, since he'd had several assessments during stints in prison. Yet he added, "I know it ain't normal for a person to go out and kill girls just to have sex with them." In response to the judge's next question, Lucas believed he was competent to stand trial, so he was granted a public defender, Don Maxfield, to represent him. When the judge entered a plea of not guilty for Lucas, the drifter asked, "Will I still be able to go on helping find bodies?" He was urged to discuss it with his attorney. By June 22nd, thanks to a front-page story, Henry Lee Lucas had become a nationally famous serial killer. The Texas Department of Public Safety had plenty of unsolved murder cases on the books, and it appeared that Lucas was good for some of them. The officers began the process by contacting other jurisdictions around the state to facilitate interviews between Lucas and relevant law enforcement officials. Word spread as well to officers in other states with open murder cases, since Lucas had drifted around the country for several years. His descriptions just might fit their Jane Does, so they were granted interviews. In fact, when an officer mentioned to the prisoner where he was from, Lucas would often say, "Oh yeah, I got me some there in your area." Not everyone believed him, and those with doubts sought corroborating evidence, but it often seemed that Lucas, with his prodigious memory, offered details about a murder that had not been printed in the press, so his description seemed credible. He also told them that he knew how not to leave evidence, and in many cases, his confession was the only thing that tied him to a body. That made the requirement for corroboration difficult. Those officers who coordinated the interviews urged all incoming detectives to follow a careful protocol, but ultimately, it was the job of each jurisdiction to decide if they accepted Lucas as the killer they sought. For the court, 3 psychiatrists were appointed to examine Lucas, and although a gag order was imposed, reporters flocked to Texas to try to get whatever they could, if only a quote from a grocery clerk who had served the homely outlaw some coffee. His notoriety blossomed, and several television news shows requested tapes of interviews. Lucas signed statements about specific murders and offered drawings of more than 70 bodies to officers who came or requested information. And he soon had 7 cases cleared, including one that would become famously linked to him. He described a woman he'd killed in 1979 and dumped several years earlier in a culvert off Interstate 35 north of Georgetown, Texas. When found, she wore only a pair of orange socks, so the officers had dubbed her Orange Socks. Lucas not only described her and confessed to killing her in several statements, but also took officers straight to where he dumped her. Over several months, he offered more summaries for murders for which he had not yet been questioned, including a husband and wife in one Texas county who'd owned a liquor store. Sometimes he murdered to rob and then eliminate witnesses. Other times, he just enjoyed the transient feeling of power it gave him. Usually, he'd quickly killed the girls or women he'd picked up because he preferred sexual contact with a corpse, although Stephen Egger, who interviewed him, indicates in serial murder an elusive phenomenon, that he was impotent. "To me," he said in an interview, "a live woman ain't nothing." Lucas generally used a knife or strangled them, but he was an advocate for trying different methods so as to not leave a pattern that police might link together. He appeared to be quite buoyant about his arrest, according to American justice, and to accept with complacency that he could get the death penalty. It seemed that being in prison suited him just fine, especially because he was treated well and probably had better food and shelter than he was used to. He did all he could to cooperate, and the officers generally found him congenial. Nevertheless, he would prove to be a trickster. Lucas was arraigned for the Orange Socks murder on August 2, 1983, but in a surprise turnaround on August 12th, claimed that he was not guilty of Becky Powell's murder, despite his initial statements. At the end of September, he waived his right to a trial for the murder of Kate Rich and pled guilty, receiving a sentence of 75 years. The following month, his attorney asked the judge to consider throwing out Lucas's written and videotaped statements about his murder of Becky Powell. On the tape, Lucas was shown calmly describing how he'd killed and dismembered her and had sexual contact with the corpse, so the judge decided the material would be admissible. In addition, the option of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity was denied. That left Lucas's defender with few options, but it was Lucas himself who proved to be his own defender's greatest hurdle. Lucas not only went to trial that November, but also testified on his own behalf and seemed to hope to be convicted. His attorney was Tom Whitlock, who argued that Lucas had not intended to kill Becky. On the stand, a tearful Lucas admitted to Becky's murder, but said he didn't know quite how it happened, and he was full of remorse over it. Then, after he was convicted and received a life sentence, he congratulated the prosecutor with, "You did a good job." Lucas then issued a statement to the effect that he'd not tried to win because he didn't want to. Previously, he'd bragged to police that he was smart and could get out of anything if he wanted to. His next trial would be for orange socks, but this time it would be a capital crime where the death penalty was a possibility. Before that occurred, Lucas got back in touch with an old friend and traveling partner, Otis Toole. If not for Otis, he'd never have met Becky. In 1976, after years in prison for various crimes, Lucas had teamed up in Florida with arsonist and serial killer Otis Elwood Toole, 29, who enjoyed mutilating corpses. They met, says David Frazier in Murder Cases of the 20th Century, in a Skid Row rescue mission in Jacksonville. Although he's often been cast in Lucas's shadow, Toole had his own gruesome story, and in the end, it may be that he was in fact the more degenerate of the two of them. He was a grade school dropout with an IQ just above mentally retarded, and supposedly he'd been introduced to sex before the age of 10 by his older sister and a gay neighbor. Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. Abandoned by his alcoholic father, he grew up in the custody of his mother, whom he claims dressed him as a girl, and his sister. His mother supposedly was a religious fanatic, while Toole's grandmother had been a Satanist, writes Michael Newton in the Encyclopedia of Serial Killers, and had dubbed him the Devil's Child. He'd watch her dig up graves in search of body parts to use in her rituals. Already a serial arsonist, getting erotic enjoyment out of the fires he set, and frequent runaway, he committed his first murder at age 14. A traveling salesman had picked him up for sex, and once they were in the woods, Toole ran the man over with his own car. And yet, he dressed in drag to hunt for dates at the rescue mission. Toole was suspected in 4 other murders across the country before he met Lucas in Florida. These involved shootings in Nebraska and Colorado, and 2 stabbings in Colorado. Toole had been married briefly, but his wife managed to spend only 3 days with him before she departed. In retrospect, it's no wonder. When Toole met Lucas at the soup kitchen, they went home together to have sex and soon became regular lovers. Apparently, they recognized the kindred soul in each other, so they traveled the country from 1978 until 1982. Lucas gave an interview in which he said that he had to re-educate Toole in the art of murder, which became the basis for Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Having studied prison records of how men were caught, he wanted to be certain that Toole could follow directions and avoid detection. He was doing his crimes all one way, Lucas said. I started to correct him in his ways, in doing the crime where he wouldn't leave information. They traveled together from one state to another, reportedly 26 states and D.C., and their favorite prey were female hitchhikers for Lucas or males for Toole. But they also slaughtered people they robbed. Lucas indicated that he had no feelings for any of the people they picked up. He'd have a good time with them and then kill them and dump them out along the side of the road. One time, he'd even ridden across 2 states with the head of a victim in his back seat before he realized he'd kept it. During that time, Toole is mentioned in some accounts as having introduced Lucas to the Hand of Death cult, telling him how they killed children for sacrifice to Satan. Max Call describes what they did in service to this cult, supposedly learning to use rape as a tool of punishment and murder as part of the cult's overall plan. They trained people like Otis and Henry to become killing machines. However, there was no corroboration for this story, so law enforcement dismissed it as the imagination of a loser trying to seem more special than he was. In 1977, Toole married a woman 24 years his senior and insisted that she share him with Lucas. According to interviews she later gave, he told her he couldn't perform with a woman unless he also knew he could get a man, so the following year they separated. Lucas's story is equally sordid, and it bears some odd similarities. Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in the backwoods of Virginia to a man who'd lost both legs in a train accident. Some sources say this was his stepfather, and a woman named Viola, a half-Chippewa who made a living for her small family with prostitution and bootlegging. Reportedly, she was mean when she drank. Lucas said that she'd entertain clients in front of him, his brother, and his father. Some sources indicate he had 8 siblings. He even claims, difficult as it is to believe, that when he walked out one time in disgust, his mother found him and beat him for not watching her with a client. He also said that she used to dress him up as a little girl, which humiliated him. Egger says that a half-sister claimed to have a picture of Henry with curls and wearing a dress. Psychologists who later evaluated Lucas indicated that his hatred of his mother was the source of his violent misogyny. Lucas's father reportedly dragged himself outside into the snow one day and contracted a fatal case of pneumonia. Once, when he was 5, his mother struck him in the head with a wooden board. He claimed that she knocked him out for a period of 3 days. Some sources say 1 day, others indicate 11 hours, and therefore he suffered from headaches, dizzy spells, and blackouts. He also took a knife wound to his left eye, which left him with a vulnerable area on his face that would soon hurt in an accident at school. His damaged eye was replaced with a glass eye that left him with a drooping eyelid. According to Egger, children who knew him found him sullen and antisocial. Another story Lucas told is that one of his mother's lovers got him interested in bestiality with the slain carcasses of dogs and sheep. He first killed someone, he said, just before he turned 15 in 1951. The reason he murdered this teenage girl was to see what it was like to have sex with a human, or so the story goes. Lucas certainly enjoyed the reactions his tales received, and interviewers duly wrote them down. In 1952, Lucas got in trouble with the law. On June 12, 1952, he burglarized an appliance store and was sent to a reformatory for 2 years. Upon release, he committed a felony and got 4 years at the Virginia State Penitentiary. He escaped, stole a car, and made his way to Michigan, where he was arrested and returned to prison. When he was finally done with his sentence, he went to live with his half-sister in Tecumseh, Michigan. Then his mother came for a visit. She was 74 at the time. On January 11, 1960, after drinking too much, Lucas and his mother got into an argument, supposedly over a woman Lucas wanted to marry. He grabbed a knife and plunged it into her neck. He remembered only that he knocked her a little and she had a heart attack. Lucas was convicted of second-degree murder and sent to a state prison in southern Michigan. There, he tried to commit suicide and was transferred to a forensic psychiatric hospital. For his mother's murder, he served 10 years of a 20-year sentence. But then, as soon as he was released, he got 3.5 years for trying to kidnap 2 girls. Once he was out, he moved to Pennsylvania and got married in 1975, but abandoned his wife when she accused him of molesting her daughters. That's when the one-eyed killer started to travel. In Florida, he took up with Toole, and they went cross-country together. For a while, Toole's orphaned nephew and niece, Frank and Becky Powell, came with them. Lucas had started having sex with Becky when she was only 12, while they'd been rolling around on a bed, tickling each other. She seemed willing to do anything to be with him, and he later said he grew to love her. He liked that she seemed to accept everything he said. When Toole's mother died in 1981, he started drinking and taking drugs. Around this time, on July 27th, 6-year-old Adam Walsh disappeared from a shopping mall. On August 10th, his head was found in a canal ditch in Vero Beach. Toole later claimed to be his killer, and this murder precipitated the show America's Most Wanted, hosted by Adam's father, John Walsh. The assistant police chief believed him, but then later cleared him as a suspect, and he did recant this crime. Lucas took Becky with him in 1982 because he wanted her to himself, and Toole was so angered by their betrayal that he allegedly killed 9 people in 6 different states in the course of 13 months. He was caught in Florida burning a building and was imprisoned with a 20-year sentence. He admitted to having set some 40 fires. But that did not bring back his former lover or his niece. In fact, Toole would never see Becky again. In the meantime, Lucas had wandered around Texas with his child bride, finally settling with Kate Rich. However, relatives disliked them and kicked them out, according to the American Justice documentary. They found a new home near Stoneburg in a Pentecostal commune, a former chicken ranch, known as the House of Prayer. The head of the group, Reuben Moore, was both a lay minister and a contractor. So he gave Lucas and Becky, who claimed to be husband and wife, a shack to live in, Egger says a trailer, and hired Lucas for some odd jobs. Mac's call indicates that Lucas left Florida when he did to avoid implications in the murder of a female schoolteacher, and he also writes that the new digs in Texas had connections to the Hand of Death cult, in which Lucas was supposedly a member. Call also described Kate Smith as a member, suggesting that she paid Lucas for activities involving organized crime. There's no reason to suppose any of that was true. According to the story Lucas told, Becky eventually tired of the living conditions and wanted to return home. On August 24, 1982, the day after Lucas's birthday, Becky argued with him, saying she missed her family, but Lucas was afraid that he'd lose her if they went back, so he resisted. He also knew he faced a warrant for stealing a truck. But Becky would not give up. She pouted and cried, so he finally relented and told her to get ready to go. Because he had no license plates on his car, he decided they should hitchhike, and they got a ride as far as Denton, Texas, north of Dallas. Lucas then got a 6-pack of beer and tried again to persuade Becky to give up the idea. She argued back, which reminded Lucas of his mother, and then Becky slapped him. He'd reacted by killing her with a meat-carving knife, shoving it straight into her chest. He was angry, he later said, that she just would not take responsibility for herself. To his horror, she died quickly. She was gone before I knew it. Then, right next to the interstate, on a blanket that Becky had spread for them to sleep, he raped the corpse. He thought it was the best sex he'd ever had with her. He then removed her head, dismembered her, removing her hands with special care, and cut the trunk of her body into 2 large pieces. The person who once had been Becky now lay there in 9 pieces. These he placed into a pillowcase, but then he removed them and just scattered them around a nearby field. He also dumped Becky's purse in a small suitcase. No one knew them around these parts, he figured, so no one could trace it. Later, he expressed regret because he claimed that he truly loved Becky. Once he cleaned off her blood, he hitched a ride back to the House of Prayer and told Moore and the others that Becky had gotten into a truck and left him. Then, a couple of weeks later, he returned to the area to bury some of the remains in a shallow hole near a copse of trees. Within another week, he was contemplating another murder. It was about 3 weeks after Becky's demise, on September 16th, that things went sour with Kate Rich. Lucas went into Ringgold, where she lived, knocked on her door, and asked if she wanted to help him look for Becky, or so he told the Rangers. She agreed to go, happy to get out of the house, and Lucas stopped first for beer. On the car seat between them was a butcher's knife. Lucas clearly had something else in mind, since he knew that Becky was dead. Whether or not Kate questioned him about going north, the wrong direction, is anyone's guess. Lucas had downed a lot of beer when he said he was seized with the idea of killing Kate. He drove down a dirt road past a campground and then stopped the car. He grabbed the knife and shoved it into Kate's left side, pushing her against the door. He pulled the knife out and went around to the passenger side. When he opened the door, Kate fell onto the ground. She was dead from a wound to her heart. Lucas was immediately aroused, so he pulled the corpse down an embankment and removed the clothing. I got naked, he told the Rangers, and screwed her until I finished. He then dragged her to a large drainage pipe near the road. He shoved both the corpse and the clothing into it as far as he could until he felt certain no one would find her. The next day, Lucas left the House of Prayer and took off, getting as far as Needles, California before the car gave out. But Lucas wasn't finished with Kate. He drifted for a month and then returned to where he'd hidden the body. He learned that he was suspected in her disappearance and endured a polygraph examination, but he got away with it. No one arrested him. Lucas retrieved the decomposing remains and put them into a stove at the house of prayer to incinerate them. After his confession, investigators went to where Lucas had indicated he'd killed Kate and found the drainage pipe, a broken pair of women's glasses, and a pair of panties. Back at the house of prayer, in the wood-burning stove, they found ashes and what looked like human bone and burnt flesh. In another area where Lucas had dumped ashes, they also found bone fragments. Lucas also showed them where he'd thrown Kate's purse, exactly the spot where it had been found months before. Officers, including Texas Rangers, then took Lucas to the Denton area to try to find Becky's remains. He went right to the copse of trees where he'd buried her and pointed to several areas on the ground. They dug at 7 different locations and found clothing, bones, a skull, and decomposing remains. The corroboration of 2 murders, both of which appeared to show experience with killing and hiding evidence, made the possibility that Lucas was telling the truth about others, even 100 others, seemed more likely now to at least some of the officers. Lucas wanted to clear his conscience entirely. So, after he was convicted of Becky's murder, he wrote Otis Toole a 4-page letter to inform him of Becky's death and to get his assistance in recalling the details of the murders they'd committed together. He said that he hadn't yet mentioned Toole, although he had, and would leave it up to him as to whether he wanted to be involved. In fact, the Jacksonville police had already been contacted about murders in their area committed by these 2 losers. The letter went to Toole in prison. He'd heard about Lucas's confessions, and he readily backed them up, adding gruesome details of his own. Toole offered details that seemed to clear some 24 murders in 11 states, and he agreed that he'd participated with Lucas in over 100 killings. In one disturbing phone call that they were allowed to make, their first contact in 2 years, Toole urged Lucas to go ahead and spit it out if there was a crime that he'd had a hand in. Toole also tried to goad Lucas into admitting to cannibalism. In a documentary made for American Justice, he was quoted in a taped conversation as saying, "Remember that one time I said I wanted to try some ribs? Did that make me a cannibal?" He indicated that they both had filleted some meat from the bodies and mentioned that he'd poured out some blood so he could see what the male victim tasted like. Lucas responded, "I've seen bodies cut up worse than you've ever seen bodies cut up." Otis ignored this one-upmanship and indicated that with barbecue sauce, it tasted like real meat. Lucas said that he'd abstained from that behavior because he didn't like the taste of barbecue sauce. He did tell Toole that they had the devil in them that made them do these things that most people didn't. "You and I have become the same things that people look at as animals," Lucas stated, as quoted in Cox's book. After about half an hour, they said goodbye to each other, apparently having thoroughly enjoyed the repulsive show they'd put on for law enforcement. Bob Prince from the Lucas Task Force spotted the game and believed it decreased their credibility. Despite Lucas's claim to want to do the right thing, he simply took too much delight in what he was doing. Later, the partners were brought face to face when Lucas was taken to Jacksonville to talk with officers there, but said nothing of substance. Toole forgave Lucas for killing Becky, shrugging it off as her time to die. With new information supplied by Lucas, Toole received a death sentence when it was determined that one of the fires he'd set had killed a man. He received a second death sentence for the murder of an elderly woman, but both were commuted to life. After Thanksgiving in 1983, the Texas Rangers spearheaded the Henry Lee Lucas Task Force. In a one-day event sponsored by the Texas Department of Public Safety on December 7th, Texas lawmen questioned Lucas in the hopes of closing their open cases. At the time, Lucas had taken credit for around 126 murders, and the Rangers believed that 35 were clearly associated with him. However, they were also aware that Lucas had lied about some and had said he was unclear about details of others because he'd been under the influence of alcohol or drugs. While they collected information and contacted other agencies, they filled in gaps about Lucas's whereabouts as best they could during his murdering years. Then, for 3 days in January 1984, 107 officers from 18 states and the District of Columbia filled the Holodome in Monroe, Louisiana, for a second conference about the homicides allegedly killed by Henry Lee Lucas. The first one, drawing not quite as many, had been in October. At that time, it was announced that 72 cases had been cleared on Lucas and Toole, and that they were suspects in 71 more cases. he was going to be allowed to book interviews by phone or in person until his murder trial in March for the Orange Socks murder. He had 2 court-appointed attorneys looking after his rights. The Rangers urged officers not to give Lucas too many details or photographs because they wanted to be certain that cases that were cleared stayed clear. Lucas did appear to close cases and accurately lead investigators to crime scenes. He knew details about murders to which he confessed that had not been published in the press. In a case in Kennewick, Washington, he described the murder of a woman in impressive detail, and his blood was matched to blood on a towel, which he said he'd used to wipe his hand after cutting himself with the murder weapon. I had no feelings for the people themselves or any of the crimes, he stated. I'd pick them up hitchhiking, running, and playing, stuff like that. We'd get to going and having a good time. First thing you'd know, I'd killed her and threw her out somewhere. Finally, he faced his most serious charge. The trial for the murder of the victim, known only as Orange Socks, took place in March in San Angelo, Texas. District Attorney Ed Walsh was the chief prosecutor, while Don Higginbottom and Parker McCulloch defended Lucas. The case was to be heard before Judge John Carter, who'd recently presided over the trial of nurse Janine Jones for the murder of a child. The trial began with reports of how the victim had been murdered, including Lucas's edited confession. In a written statement and on tape, he described how he'd picked her up as a hitchhiker, had sex with her, killed her, had sex again, and dumped her in the culvert, skinning his knee on the guardrail. A videotape showed Lucas directing police officers to where he dropped the victim's body. However, the defense attorneys proved that the unedited tape revealed that Lucas sometimes contradicted himself and suffered from key lapses in memory. The sheriff even had to refresh his memory at times during the interview, which suggested that Lucas simply read the sheriff's desire for information and gave him what he wanted. The defense also used work records to show that Lucas had been in Florida on October 31st and had cashed a check on November 1st, and they tied it all up with psychiatric testimony to show that Lucas was insane. Psychologist Tom Kubizin said that Lucas had an IQ of 84, a desire to feel important, a feeling of inferiority, and a belief that he could not direct his own actions. He also had schizophrenia. Lucas cried in court when he heard all of this, forcing a recess. The prosecution hit back with evidence that suggested that Lucas's boss might have recorded his presence at work when he was not there. They also supplied psychiatric testimony that Lucas was not insane. In addition, on one of the tapes, Lucas claimed 360 murders. "We killed him almost every way there is, except poison," detailing exactly what he meant. Despite the defense's best efforts, not the least of which was a client who had proved most helpful to the other side, the jury convicted Lucas and sentenced him to die. Afterward, he seemed unfazed, even happy. It was as if he'd finally become someone of importance. Yet not everyone who'd been at the trial agreed with the verdict. It seemed that Lucas only knew key facts about the crime after the sheriff had refreshed his memory. "It was the worst confession," said Hugh Ainsworth, a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald, who decided to do some more digging. Lucas's case occurred in the midst of an incident in Texas that provides some context for its eventual unraveling, so let's look first at that one. Roger Draper, in a lengthy 1994 article about the one-time frontier ethic of the Texas Rangers for Texas Monthly, discusses Lucas in the context of what he refers to as the infamous Brandley case. Draper states that this epitomized the wrong-headedness of the Ranger way. On August 28, 1980, Ranger Wesley Stiles investigated the assault and strangulation murder of a high school cheerleader. He arrested the custodian, Clarence Brandley, the next day without having questioned a single witness. He was quickly charged with capital murder. A jury later convicted him on nothing more than tenuous circumstantial evidence. But Stiles's tunnel vision approach was reviewed in 1989 by the Court of Criminal Appeals, and the justices found that he had ignored evidence that pointed to other suspects. He'd also threatened the state's star witness and lied on the stand. Brandley, on death row, was freed. Before that conviction was overturned and the Rangers embarrassed by one of their own, they were already going through a much more humiliating process at the hands of Lucas. Their zeal was commendable, but not their approach. One ranger in particular bought the whole package. Max Call was one of the Texas Rangers who took over the Lucas case. Although Call's book, Hand of Death, is generally discredited since he not only befriended Lucas but also accepted everything Lucas said at face value, Call even named Lucas as a member of the Lucas Task Force. It may nevertheless be the best account available of what Lucas actually said. Call makes it clear that Lucas was getting plenty of attention, a high-security cell, good food, and numerous trips in the company of 2 Texas Rangers. That's motivation for a man with nothing to keep making up whoppers. Henry worshipped Satan, Call writes, and believed his lies because he found justification for his fantasies in Satan's service. Call believed that Lucas had joined Toole in the so-called Hand of Death cult in the Florida Everglades, and he thought that by writing the book, he would be warning people about this dangerous organization. He seemed to genuinely believe that Henry Lee Lucas assisted in 360 rapes and murders at the behest of the Hand of Death, which supposedly had links to organized crime and practiced the sacrifice of females. In fact, Lucas indicated that they'd recruited and trained him specifically to become a killing machine, and he was able to describe just how these supposed sacrifices worked. Call's gullibility is obvious when he says that Lucas wanted to confess as a way of exposing the cult, and it's likely that Lucas keyed into Call's own religious beliefs to hook him and play him. The book is replete with religious ideology, especially when it seems that Becky's found the way out through the Bible. Call seems to like this moral angle, playing it up whenever he can. In addition, he accepts whatever Lucas tells him. For example, Lucas apparently described Toole as a nice-looking young man, when in fact Toole is closer to winning the contest for homeliest serial killer. Unfortunately, most of Call's chapter about Lucas's childhood experience with his mother was clearly uncorroborated, and there's no way of knowing how much is factual. Lucas was angry at his mother, and he likely skewed the story to make her look as evil as possible. Other authors have picked up on this account, including psychologists and criminologists, so it's important to reiterate that there's little in Lucas's account of his childhood that bears the stamp of corroborated fact. Anything that Call writes about must be viewed with some skepticism, especially since he recreates it as a story with dialogue and incidents he never witnessed. As Lucas's death toll climbed to some 600 victims in 27 different states and in Canada, according to some accounts, though others cap it at 360, it began to seem as if he was just a compulsive confessor. He'd added in the satanic cult activity, which at the time seemed to justify his numbers, but it only made some people suspicious that it was all a hoax. Cox describes how reporter Hugh Ainsworth, co-writer with Stephen Michaud on a book about Ted Bundy, sat through Lucas's trial and had his doubts. He did some sleuthing and found that Lucas had been out of state or in prison at times when some of the murders to which he'd confessed had occurred. That inspired McLennan County DA Vic Fiesel to look into Lucas's confessions to 2 murders in his own area. Apparently, Lucas had written a letter to a reporter in Fort Worth suggesting that he was not actually responsible for all the murders he'd claimed, and that the parents of one of Lucas's supposed victims decided after reviewing his statement that he was not the killer of their daughter. Ainsworth had interviewed Lucas himself and wrote a lengthy piece that was published on April 14, 1984. He asked the important question, was it all a hoax? He believed it was, and accused the task force of failing to follow leads that may have undermined Lucas's credibility, such as noting the distance between crime scenes that made it virtually impossible for Lucas to have committed some murders that were close together in time. He thought the information about many of the murders had been fed to Lucas in order to close the cases. Supposedly, Lucas had finally admitted that he was good for only 3 murders in his life: his mother, Becky, and Kate. But Lucas told a lay sister, who then told other reporters, that he'd lied to Ainsworth and was in fact the monstrous killer he'd claimed. His newfound religion forced him to tell the truth. But Lucas told a lay sister, who then told other reporters. Officers involved insisted that they did not believe everything Lucas said, but when he knew key unpublished details and could lead them directly to a crime scene, that was convincing evidence. He certainly had killed far more than 3. In fact, by that point, writes Cox, 189 murders had been cleared and attributed to him. On April 23rd, he said that the only person he'd ever killed was his mother, and that had been an accident. He'd been able to clear so many murders because the Rangers had given him everything he needed to do so: pictures, reports, and even leading him to the crime scenes. He got a live appearance on Good Morning America to repeat his allegations. His decision to recant, he said, was based on his belief in God, the same reason he'd earlier given to confess to so many murders. This news was just as stunning as his initial confession, and the officers involved quickly mobilized to try to piece together some dignity. Apparently, Lucas enjoyed shocking law enforcement with numbers, perverse activities, and gruesome details. Nevertheless, he did point to places where victims were found, and now it's estimated by some that he was responsible for some 40 to 50 murders. On the other hand, those who make this estimation may also be saving face, not willing to admit that they may have fed him information. Ryan reports the manner in which Lucas typically confessed to a number of unsolved murders. If a police agency suspected Lucas, and if Lucas admitted involvement, and his total of some 3,000 confessions suggest he rarely denied complicity, they would send the Lucas Task Force a case file with information pertaining to the unsolved crime. Lucas would be questioned at length and sometimes even allowed to read police reports, thus learning any number of details previously known only to police, which he could then regurgitate at will. The Rangers insisted that Lucas was a serial killer, and they were reportedly annoyed with Feasel for interfering. They claimed that they'd taken much more care in keeping details from Lucas than they were being accused of. Yet Draper says that one ranger told the DA, "I'm going to make you regret this if it's the last thing I do." But the damage had been done. The media had picked up on this hoax, which was nearly too good to be true, and Lucas's status changed from one of the world's most notorious killers to one of the world's most notorious liars. No matter what he said now, no one would believe it. This made all those in law enforcement who had rushed to interview him and who had closed cases look rather lame. Several retired Rangers later said that it was their impression during the interrogations that Lucas was a liar. Still, it was difficult for them to accept that in cases where Lucas led them to the right spot where a body had lain, he had nothing to do with it. He simply knew too much about certain crimes on his own, without assistance. Then, on April 29th, Lucas returned to some of his original statements. He gave an interview to a radio show personality, indicating that, "I have killed the people I said I killed." He again put the figure at 360. Then he said that everything was a lie and indicated that the Hands of Death cult was going to assassinate him. No one knew quite what to make of a killer confessing to so many crimes he did not do, but then he insisted that he'd been forced to recant. His persistent waffling further reduced his credibility. Police are familiar with several types of false confessions, including from people who confess spontaneously to something they did not do. That's usually in response to a high-profile case, in the hope of becoming famous. Sometimes it's about misplaced guilt, where the confessor believes he should be punished for something, anything. There are also coerced confessions, usually offered when the person under interrogation is exhausted, naive, frightened, or mentally impaired. Some people fear that the interrogation will be stressful, so they capitulate quickly. But on rare occasions, a person may internalize the events and actually believe he or she did it. That occurs when an interrogator seems confident of the suspect's guilt and may even lie or use manipulative tactics. The characteristics of those most likely to falsely confess include youth, a low IQ, mental illness or confusion, a high degree of suggestibility, a trusting nature, low self-esteem, high anxiety, and a poor memory. But the person seeking to attach himself to a specific case seems closest to what Lucas did. In Texas Monthly, Draper indicates that the Rangers had been overeager in their desire to close open cases, so they provided Lucas with some of the details he needed to confess. They called it helping to refresh his memory, and he fully exploited it for his own ends. He had nothing whatsoever to lose, but plenty to gain by way of entertainment and feeling empowered. In fact, Lucas confessed to a murder in Little Rock, Arkansas that had already been solved, which made a DA there suspicious of his admissions. The same thing happened with West Virginia officials when Lucas claimed credit for killing a police officer whose death was determined to have been a suicide. In another Arkansas case, Lucas could not offer details until after state police had shown him a crime scene video that they'd made. It was easy then for him to give them whatever they needed to tie him to that murder. He also confessed to a killing in Delaware in which there was already a suspect in custody. That suspect eventually confessed as well. "I set out to break and corrupt any law enforcement officer I could get," Lucas said. "I think I did a pretty good job." Through dubious methods, says Draper, the Rangers extracted literally hundreds of confessions from Henry Lee Lucas. Perhaps Lucas was living by the principle that Edgar attributes to him. If rules befitted him, he went along. If they didn't, he broke them. In other words, he cleaved to whatever he thought was in his best interest at the moment. On June 11, 1984, further investigations of open cases were halted, while many of the cleared cases had already been reopened. Lucas was transferred to the state prison at Huntsville, claiming that his rights prior to the trial for Orange Socks had been violated. Somehow, he believed that by undermining law enforcement as he'd done, he'd regain his freedom. He told one officer he'd be free in a month. In 1991, Otis Toole received 4 more life sentences for the murders of 3 women and a man in Florida between 1980 and 1981. Lucas was charged along with them, but not brought to Florida for prosecution. 5 years later, in 1996, Toole died in prison from cirrhosis of the liver. Before that happened, a curious incident involved his former partner, Lucas. Many serial killers attract groupies, and while Lucas was not among the best-looking men, he was certainly notorious and had his share of admirers. One woman, Phyllis Wilcox, even came up with a plot to free him by posing as his supposedly murdered former girlfriend. Ryan McMichael includes an interview with her on his website, given after she wrote to him in 2000 when he posted an online blog about Lucas. According to this story, in October 1992, Wilcox posed as Becky, all grown up, although some 15 years older than Becky would have been at the time, claiming that she was still alive so that she could get him out of that murder rap. She was actually a mother and grandmother, age 40, and living in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. She met Lucas via correspondence after reading a book about him, and she soon visited. She indicates that although she was nervous about going into prison and quite intimidated by the sight of Lucas in handcuffs surrounded by guards, she had a wonderful time and made many more visits thereafter. Among the subjects they discussed was Becky Powell. Lucas apparently claimed that he'd seen Becky get into a truck, but he told authorities that he'd killed her so they wouldn't attempt to implicate her in the murders that he'd committed. In other words, she says, he told Wilcox that Becky was still alive. Lucas also denied killing Kate Rich in Orange Socks, indicating that the oven in which he supposedly had burned Kate was too small for a woman as fat as she was and would not have gotten hot enough to have burned her to ash. He was sure that the authorities found some chicken bones, nothing more, and exaggerated their significance. About Orange Socks, he claimed that the bruises around her neck did not even fit his hands. But he did admit that he'd murdered his mother. Wilcox bought it all and confessed to McMichael that despite being married, she soon became obsessed with Lucas, thinking and dreaming about him all the time. She knew she was falling in love. He accepted her feelings and told her he loved her too. It wasn't long before Wilcox grew afraid that Lucas might be executed, so she devised a plan to make sure that didn't happen. She believed that he was innocent of the charges. She'd even come up with a way to exonerate him in her mind of killing his mother by blaming someone else. So she posed as Becky and Lucas backed her up. He said that he'd only confessed to murdering Becky because he wanted to embarrass the police. He seems to have forgotten that they actually picked up Becky's remains as Lucas showed them where each piece was. They didn't get away with it. Fraser indicates that Wilcox was revealed, when this hoax was unraveled, as a diagnosed schizophrenic who had also corresponded with John Wayne Gacy and Charles Manson. But Lucas was still determined to beat his death sentence. While it was clear that Lucas had committed 4 murders, including his mother, even one of those, Orange Socks, eventually came under doubt. The only thing linking Lucas to Orange Socks was essentially his confession. In fact, some 213 cases had been cleared through Lucas's confessions, which concerned the writers of the Lucas Report, a document commissioned by the Texas Attorney General's office. Ultimately, Lucas was convicted of only 11 homicides, says Egger, though some criminologists believe he was responsible for between 40 to 50 murders. Still, no one knows for sure. The death sentence for the murder of Orange Socks stood for many years, although Lucas received 2 stays of execution because the evidence was too slim. Apparently, it was now the case that the work records that had been discredited at the trial were now considered viable evidence on Lucas's behalf. That's because a lot more research has been done. Former Attorney General's investigator Michael Feary had developed a thick file about Lucas's whereabouts on the night that Orange Socks had been murdered. The documentation made it clear that he was indeed in Jacksonville, Florida. Feary had utilized records such as paycheck stubs and insurance reports to track Lucas as he drifted around the Southeast. He was ready to submit all of this on Lucas's behalf, and it was entered into evidence when Lucas received a hearing in 1996 about his death sentence. Lucas took the witness stand, writes Gene Pagel for the Associated Press, to say that he did not kill the woman known as Orange Socks. He cried and for about 15 minutes spoke in a trembling voice before U.S. District Judge Sam R. Cummings. Lucas said that he'd given false information when he'd confessed to the murder, and added that he was able to give a lot of facts about the crime because he'd read the case file. In fact, he had an alibi. He was in Florida putting out a car fire. The Assistant Texas Attorney General, Gina Blount, took him to task for playing games with investigators, and Lucas denied that it had been a game. "I had my reasons," he responded. He received a stay, and 2 years later, the matter went to the governor. In 1998, based on the lack of evidence connecting Lucas to the murder and the existence of contradictory evidence, then Texas Governor George W. Bush commuted Lucas's sentence to life, the only man to receive this during Bush's reign. 7 years later, in 2005, in the New York Review of Books, Sister Helen Prejean, author of Dead Man Walking, wrote about Bush's decision. She suggested that he'd been motivated more by expediency than conscience, and offered the relevant supporting facts. During his 6 years as governor of Texas, Bush had presided over 152 executions, more than any other governor in any other state in recent history. He'd commuted no other death sentences to life, although there were factors as significant as any that Lucas's attorneys offered. Journalist Alan Berlow apparently discovered that Bush's examination of at least 57 of these cases involved only cursory reviews of brief death penalty memos on the day before the scheduled execution. In one case, Bush had skipped over evidence that the convicted man was mentally retarded and therefore not even eligible for the death penalty. Prejean calls the Texas Board of Pardons and Appeals a farce that Bush did nothing to reform. Then she writes about Lucas. In the Henry Lee Lucas case in 1998, Bush showed where the real power lay. He intervened with the board before they had a chance to make a recommendation, and afterward, the board approved his decision in a 17-1 vote. Prejean points out that it was common knowledge by then that Lucas could not have murdered the woman known as Orange Socks. Additionally, she writes, it was clear that Lucas would never be a threat to society because he was already serving 6 life sentences for other murders, which he may or may not have committed, since on a fairly regular basis he confessed falsely to hundreds of murders. Bush pointed out that jurors at his trial did not know certain facts that later came to light. Thus, he took the opportunity, she claims, to exercise apparent compassion, although in the context of his actual record, his compassion diminishes into mere politics. No one knows exactly how many murders Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole committed. Given Lucas's trickster methods and propensity to lie, it's likely that no one will ever know, beyond his mother, Kate Rich, and Becky Powell. There seems to be good evidence that he killed others, but judges would not admit his confessions, so it was difficult to bring the cases to trial. In March 2001, Henry Lee Lucas died in prison of natural causes. Thus ended one of the most unusual cases in the annals of criminal psychology.
Pam Kinnamore left work on a Friday evening, July 12, 2002. A mother, decorator, and antique dealer,
Pam owned her own business called Comforts and Joys in Denham Springs, Louisiana. When her husband came home from work later that evening, Pam's car was there, but she was not. He waited for her to show up, but became worried as time passed. It was not like her to disappear without saying where she was going. Later that evening, he called the police and reported her missing. Police investigators did not initially suspect foul play. Perhaps she'd forgotten to tell her husband that she had made other plans that evening, or maybe there was an emergency with a family member. As the days passed, however, foul play became more likely. Shortly after her disappearance, Pam's family posted billboards with an award of $75,000 for her safe return and any information concerning her whereabouts. They were beginning to fear the worst-case scenario and prayed she would be found alive. Their hopes were dashed 5 days after she was reported missing. A state survey crew working near Whiskey Bay Bridge discovered a gruesome sight on July 16, 2002. Located on the boundary line between Baton Rouge and Lafayette, in a marshy area of the woods beneath the bridge, they noticed a human-like figure lying at the water's edge. As they approached, they discovered it was the nude body of a dead woman. It was Pam Kinnemore. Her remains were sent to the Orleans Parish Coroner's Office, where an autopsy was conducted. She had died from gash wounds to the neck, believed to have been made by a knife. She had non-consensual sex. Police learned that Kinnemore's death bore similarities to 2 other murdered women found in the same general area months earlier. Investigators suspected that, on the night of her disappearance, the killer found his way into the Kinnemore family home at 8338 Briarwood Place in Baton Rouge and abducted Pam. Because there was no sign of forced entry, police believe she trustingly led the killer in, or he entered through an unlocked window or door. At the time her body was discovered, it appeared as if the killer had taken a trophy of his victim. A plain silver toe ring that Kinnemore almost always wore had been removed from her body. Investigators believe the ring, if found, could be valuable evidence linking the killer to Kinnemore. 1 week after the discovery of Kinnemore's body, police learned some important information. A woman came forward claiming that she may have seen Kinnemore's body in an unidentified pickup truck on the night of her disappearance. According to the witness, who remained under police protection for fear of her life, she saw a man driving westbound on I-10 in a white pickup truck at about 3 a.m. She claimed there was a woman fitting Kinnemore's description slumped in the passenger seat. She appeared to be sleeping or dead. The witness glimpsed a white male driver, who she described as slight in build. She noticed the truck getting off at the Whiskey Bay exit, close to where Kinnemore's remains were later found. She immediately contacted the police when she realized that there may have been a connection between the man and woman in the truck and the disappearance of Kinnemore. A statement from the police concerning the suspicious vehicle was released after more details surfaced. Police were looking for a white General Motors, probably a Chevy, pickup truck, and possibly a 1996 or 1997 single cab model. The witness claimed to have seen the symbol of a fish on the rear left side part of the truck. Investigators believe the license plate may contain JT341. The state of origin of the license plate remains unknown. The police suspected that the same truck and driver were connected to the non-consensual sex case of a 28-year-old Mississippi woman 2 days after Kinnemore went missing. The woman told police that she was stopped by a man in a white truck fitting the description of the one seen on the night of Kinnemore's disappearance. She was coerced into the vehicle on I-10 and had non-consensual sex before being let go. The police released a composite of the man in July 2002 based on the witness's information. Investigators working on the Kinnemore murder case began looking for more similarities between Pam Kinnemore's death and the earlier murders of the 2 other women. Investigators set out to match DNA samples taken from the 3 cases. As police searched, they discovered mounting evidence that suggested Kinnemore was not the killer's first victim, nor would she be his last. One of the first victims known to die at the hands of the Baton Rouge serial killer was 41-year-old Gina Wilson Green. She was a nurse and office manager for Home Infusion Network. Her body was found at her home on Stanford Avenue in Baton Rouge on September 23, 2001. The divorcee lived alone in an apartment near Louisiana State University, LSU. An autopsy report stated that she had died from asphyxiation due to strangulation at about 9 a.m. Police discovered that several items were stolen from her home, including a cloth purse and a Nokia cellular phone. The purse was never found, but the phone was later recovered across town in an alley. 8 months later, the body of another woman was found in her townhouse on Charlotte Avenue in Baton Rouge. The remains were of a 22-year-old LSU graduate named Charlotte Murray Pace. A roommate discovered her body at about 2 p.m. on May 31, 2002. She had been stabbed to death. Evidence showed the victim put up a fierce struggle before succumbing to her wounds. It was likely that her killer was also wounded during the attack. Like in Green's case, an autopsy showed evidence of non-consensual sex. Pace had recently moved before her death and lived for only 2 days at the house where her body was discovered. Her previous address was only 3 doors away from Gina Green. Investigators found no evidence that they ever knew each other. Several items were missing from Charlotte's possession. According to police reports, a brown and tan Louis Vuitton wallet with keys to Pace's BMW was stolen. The wallet contained her driver's license, as well as other personal effects. A VTech cellular phone and a silver ring were also taken. The killer did leave behind one thing police hoped would lead them to the identity of the killer: a footprint. In August 2002, a task force was formed of 40 investigators from various law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, the Baton Rouge Police Department, the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office, the Louisiana State Police, the Lafayette Parish Sheriff's Office, and the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office, among others. The multi-agency homicide task force was formed to establish a clearer line of communication among the bureaus. They believed this could help them share information better and catch the killer more quickly. Samples from the Pace crime scene were genetically compared with samples from the Green crime scene. DNA evidence indicated that the same man murdered the 2 women. Months later, the Louisiana State Crime Lab was also able to link Kinnemore's death to the same killer. Investigators continued to compare DNA samples of the killer with samples taken from several dozen unsolved murder cases over the last decade. They hoped to be able to obtain enough information so that the murderer, if caught, would be put behind bars for a long time. There was no doubt that Baton Rouge had a serial killer on the loose. By September 2002, the task force released more information concerning the footprint discovered at the murder scene of Charlotte Pace. A Rawlings brand athletic shoe made the print. The shoe, a men's size 10 or 11, was easier to identify because of its unique sole. It was a brand commonly sold at local discount stores. That month, the task force also released the detailed testimony of a woman who had an unusual encounter with a man outside a Winn-Dixie food store in mid-August. She was packing her groceries when the stranger approached her and began to question what she was doing. The man, carrying a jug of water, then followed her out of the store into the empty parking lot, chatting to her all the while. He mentioned his name was Joe and that he worked in construction. He then told her he could lift her up, although she was a large woman. Joe asked her to go out with them that night and was disappointed when she refused. The unusually persistent man said he wanted to get her a gift from his vehicle. He walked toward a large white truck that appeared to the woman to match the one connected with the murders. From his truck, he retrieved a tree vine and gave it to her. The woman was petrified and went to her car to wait for the man to leave. Shortly after the man drove off, she contacted the police. During an interview with the police, the woman was shown a sketch of a man suspected to have been involved in the killings. She said he looked just like Joe. However, the composite did not match that obtained by the Mississippi woman who had non-consensual sex with a man in a white truck 2 days following Kinnemore's disappearance. Nevertheless, investigators seized on the new evidence. Investigators analyzed surveillance videos of the parking lot, but it's unclear if the man was the suspect they sought. On November 21, 2002, a 23-year-old female Marine named Tanisha Dean Colomb disappeared. At about 1:30 p.m. that day, her black 1994 Mazda MX-3 was found with the keys in the ignition on Robbie Road in Grand Coteau. However, Colomb was nowhere in sight. 3 days later, a rabbit hunter discovered the nude remains of Colomb several hundred yards off the roadside in a wooded area of St. Landry Parish. Her body was found 30 miles from where her car had been discovered several days earlier. Medical examiners said she had been bludgeoned to death. Colomb had strongly resisted her attacker before she died. Task force investigators further revealed 1 month after her death that DNA evidence linked Colomb with the Pace, Green, and Kinnemore murders. She was to be the Baton Rouge serial killer's first known black victim and the first to be found outside the Baton Rouge area. Following Colomb's murder, FBI and task force investigators were able to provide the public with a more detailed investigative analysis of the killer and his behavior. They compiled a personality profile of the murderer based on information from similar crimes that occurred nationally and the specific details of the 4 recent crimes. According to investigators, the public release of a behavioral profile is an uncommon practice. However, the task force believed that informing the public might lead to more people coming forward with knowledge about the killer. The profile suggested the killer was male, between 25 and 35 years old. They believed he might be physically strong due to his ability to lift the bodies of the deceased women and carry them over unstable terrains, such as extremely muddy areas. He probably worked in a job that required such strength. Investigators believed it was highly likely the killer earned a below-average to average income. He probably worked in a position that required little social interaction with other people. There was evidence to suggest the murderer was able to obtain information on his victims before he abducted them. It appeared he had knowledge concerning the women's lifestyles and schedules and may have stalked them. Moreover, the 4 murders were probably planned, even though the killer showed signs of impulsivity. The behavioral analysis also suggested the killer was insecure and had difficulty interacting with women, especially those who portrayed themselves as sophisticated. Women he approached might have described him as being awkward but harmless. He may have crossed the line with some of the women he knew, those in whom he developed an intense interest. FBI profilers believe the offender likely displayed intense anger, anxiousness, irritation, and preoccupation with the news concerning the victims and any recent breakthrough discoveries relating to the cases. He may have even verbally renounced any investigative leads and blamed the victims for their deaths. In December 2002, task force investigators revealed a new lead in the case. They released a composite sketch of a man task force investigators called a person of interest. He's about 35 years old and white. The person was purportedly seen in a white pickup truck in the area where Column's body was discovered on the same day and around the same time she went missing. The truck allegedly matched the description of the one seen in connection with the murder of Kinnamore. That same month, the task force told the public that it would be collecting DNA samples from approximately 100 potential suspects. The suspects were asked to voluntarily submit saliva samples obtained from a brisk swabbing of the mouth or scraping of the cheeks. 1 month earlier, 600 men had been asked to provide such samples. Those who refused to comply were further investigated and were said to have received some pressure from investigators until they willingly volunteered. Public fears climbed steadily. Gun and pepper spray sales had greatly increased in the area, as well as enrollment in self-defense classes. Even student class attendance at LSU slightly decreased because of fears of being abducted and murdered by the Baton Rouge serial killer. Investigators realized that if they didn't catch the killer soon, panic might ensue. In January 2003, the task force announced a new major development in the Baton Rouge killer case. It found another shoe print, allegedly from the killer, in the vicinity of Colom's body. It was the second shoe print to be found in connection with the killer. The first print was found at the murder scene of Charlotte Pace. The shoe size was the same in both instances, a men's 10 to 11. The shoe print was made by a pair of $40 2002 model Adidas-type basketball shoes, likely purchased in the area. Investigators also revealed that one of Colom's possessions was missing at the time of her death. The information was released in hopes that someone would come forward with information about the suspect. Investigators believed the chances of catching the killer were becoming more likely with every new piece of evidence. In 2002, task force investigators began using electric billboards to run ads about the killer. The billboards, provided by a local company called Lamar Advertising, were used to display up-to-date information concerning the murders, including the white truck and a composite of the suspect. The number of billboards increased from 2 to 6 in 2003, covering the Lafayette and Baton Rouge areas. Investigators were looking for the best means possible to keep the public informed in the hopes it would lead to the killer's capture and the prevention of further deaths. As the investigation reached its 1.5-year mark, it began to receive harsh criticism. One of the most vocal critics was the author and criminologist Dr. Robert Keppel, known for his unique approach used to investigate serial killers, such as Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer. During an interview in February 2003, Keppel focused on 4 major mistakes made by the task force. Keppel first suggested that there is a great possibility that the murderer's name was already in the task force's possession, but could easily get overlooked in the files, especially with such a flood of information coming in. Police often obtain the name of a killer within the first 30 days of an investigation, Keppel said. Keppel also criticized the task force for revealing the DNA link between the victims, saying it might hinder the investigation. He He said it increased the likelihood that the killer might take greater care in leaving behind genetic evidence at the scene of future crimes. Keppel further stated that the public release of information concerning the shoes might also cause the killer to destroy them, making the murders more difficult to connect with him if ever caught. Moreover, he criticized the psychological profile, explaining that it only adds to information overload and takes away valuable time from the investigation. In his opinion, the only useful knowledge released by the task force was the composite sketch of the leading suspect and the information about the truck. In the interview, Keppel explained that it would be in the investigation's best interest not to focus on unusual characters that might stand out, but on someone who blends in and is usually there. On March 3, 2003, 26-year-old Carrie Lynn Yoder, a doctoral student at LSU, went missing from her home at 2450 Dodson Avenue. She lived only a few miles from Gina Green and Charlotte Pace's home. Like Columb, she lived alone. Her boyfriend of 3 years, Lee Stanton, reported her missing to police 2 days after she failed to contact him. Stanton told police he had last talked to Yoder on March 3rd, and she told him she was going to the Winn-Dixie grocery store on Burbank Drive. They made plans to talk that night or the following day, but when he did not hear from her, he began to worry. The next day, he went to check on her and noticed that her car was there and the lights were on in the house, but he did not go in. On March 5th, after still no contact, he decided to return to her house and look inside. He noticed that her keys, cellular phone, and purse were on the counter and the back door was open. It was then that he began to realize that something was terribly wrong. He immediately called the police. Stanton found everything else in the house appeared normal except for the wall-mounted key holder by the front door, which was dangling by one screw as if knocked off its hinges by force. He suggested there could have been a struggle in that area, but police did not suspect foul play. Police removed items from Yoder's home and took them to be analyzed at the crime lab. The items included her personal computer, her car, and the front door. They hoped to find fingerprints, messages, fibers, or other evidence. Upon further investigation, it was discovered that Yoder had indeed returned from the grocery store and had been home for several hours before she disappeared. Police intensely investigated her home and the surrounding area. They conducted a search using helicopters in the hopes that an aerial position might make it easier to locate her. Investigators also handed out questionnaires at the Winn-Dixie, looking for any information concerning her whereabouts. On March 13, 2003, Carrie Yoder's family and friends were confronted with their worst fears. On a rainy day, a man fishing in the Atchafalaya River Basin discovered Yoder's badly beaten body near the Whiskey Bay Bridge. She was found in the water near where Kinnamore's body had been discovered some 8 months earlier. According to medical examiners, she had died from strangulation. Moreover, it was determined that she had struggled with her killer before being asphyxiated. 1 week after her death, investigators initially claimed that there was no known link between her murder and the Baton Rouge serial killer. However, after DNA tests made from samples from the scene, she was proven to be the killer's 5th victim. Local organizations and individuals throughout Louisiana were shocked at the rash of deaths at the hand of the same person. The residents of southern Louisiana were living in daily fear that they might be the killer's next victim. Many people and area organizations donated substantial funds towards a reward for information into the arrest and conviction of the serial killer. On March 17, 2003, the friends and family of some of the victims rallied on the steps of the Louisiana State Capitol, demanding an end to the murders. They had had enough of the senseless loss of lives. Something more had to be done. A North Carolina investigative psychologist named Dr. Maurice Godwin claimed to have critical evidence concerning the murders. Godwin said he had constructed a geographical profile containing the places where the victims disappeared and where their bodies were discovered. He found that the crime scenes formed a triangular shape pattern on a map, which he believed pinpointed the area where the killer lived. Godwin claimed he presented his unique findings to task force investigators months before Yoder's death, but they showed no interest in his discovery. Godwin further claimed he was able to predict where the next murder would take place. Intriguingly, Yoder was abducted and found within the triangular shape pattern revealed by Godwin. In some respects, Godwin's theory agrees with one aspect of the profile, concerning the theory that the murders could have been planned. It was not a coincidence that Yoder was abducted from the same area where Pace and Green were murdered. Moreover, it was not a coincidence that her remains were discovered in the same vicinity as Kinnamore's. Near the end of March, the task force released important new information. The task force stated the public should no longer focus primarily on the latest sketches of the subject previously released by investigators, but on a person of any race. Moreover, the public should also be on the lookout for more than just the white truck, but any vehicle that might seem suspicious. The new information suggested that the sketch of the person of interest might not be directly related to the murders. The change in focus came after research and investigation into Carrie Yoder's case, specifically when talking with witnesses in the area. Another possible breakthrough in the case came to the public's attention just days after the task force's change of focus. A jogger found a letter addressed to Yoder several blocks from her home. Intriguingly, the letter was found on the same street where victims Gina Green and Charlotte Pace had once lived before their deaths. On April 8, 2003, the task force claimed another victim might be added to the growing list. 52-year-old prostitute Lillian Robinson from St. Martin, Louisiana, disappeared in January 2002. Robinson's niece was the last known person to see her alive. 1 month later, on February 10th, a fisherman had discovered Robinson's nude body floating in the waters of the Atchafalaya River, close to Whiskey Bay Bridge. She was found in the same vicinity where Kinamore and Yoder were later found. According to police, Robinson's remains were in an advanced state of decomposition when found, due to the fact that she'd been in the water for nearly 1 week. This made it virtually impossible to extract adequate DNA samples from her body, which could connect her with the killer. She had been murdered in a similar manner as the other victims who were linked to the Baton Rouge killer. Evidence concerning Robinson's case was handed over to the task force in the hopes that a connection could be made between her death and that of the 5 murdered women. Task force investigators were also looking into the alleged abduction of another woman who may have fallen victim to the Baton Rouge serial killer. 31-year-old mother of 2 and nurse, Melinda McGee, disappeared from her home in Altmore, Alabama on March 24, 2003. Although she lived 250 miles from Baton Rouge, evidence found at her home suggested she was abducted by the same man. McGee called her husband and mother from her job at a nursing home before 8:30 a.m. on the morning of her disappearance. It was the last they ever heard from her. Sometime after she arrived home from work, it was believed she was abducted. The local police said that there was evidence of a struggle in the McGee home, but no clues suggesting that there was a homicide. Moreover, there was not enough evidence available in which DNA samples could be drawn. Police said there were similarities between McGee's disappearance and those of Kinamore and Yoder. McGee has not been heard of since her disappearance, and no body has yet been found. Robinson and McGee were not the only other potential victims of the Baton Rouge serial killer. In May 2002, a 23-year-old LSU student, Christine Moore, left home in her car to go jogging at a park and never returned. Like in the Colombe case, Moore's car was found abandoned near River Road in Baton Rouge. Her body was found the following month on a dirt road in Iberville Parish, Louisiana. Medical examiners claim she died from blunt force trauma to the head. Although her murder was never officially recognized by the task force as connected to the Baton Rouge serial killer, there remain similarities between her case and those of some of his other victims. The police were checking 3 incidents the previous year in which a disarmingly attractive young black man either attacked or tried to attack women in St. Martin Parish. None of the 3 victims were killed. A new computer sketch was released showing a light-skinned black man. He was described as clean-cut, personable, and distinctly handsome. The man tried to charm his victims, said his name was Anthony, and behaved initially in a non-threatening manner. Previously, the Baton Rouge serial killer was thought to be white. During the last week of May 2003, DNA swabs taken from a West Feliciana Parish man who resembled the most recent composite of the suspect were rushed to the crime labs for analysis. It didn't take long for the lab technician to process the samples to realize that there was a positive match between the suspect's DNA and samples taken from Carrie Lynn Yoder. Technicians were able to further link the suspect to 3 more murders attributed to the suspected Baton Rouge serial killer. After many long months, investigators finally had their key suspect, 34-year-old Derrick Todd Lee. On May 26, 2003, police issued an arrest warrant for Lee, who fled to Chicago and then Atlanta in an effort to escape murder charges. At the time the warrant was issued, he and his family had been gone for approximately 3 weeks. Police learned that on the day Lee voluntarily provided a DNA sample, his wife Jacqueline withdrew their young son and daughter from school, claiming they were moving to Los Angeles. The couple then quickly packed up their belongings and abandoned their brown brick ranch-style house on 4273 US 61 in St. Francisville of West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. On May 27, 2003, Atlanta police working with a joint FBI Metropolitan Atlanta task force apprehended Lee at a hotel where he was lodging. Lee waived extradition and was flown back to Louisiana the following day. Initially, he was charged with only Carrie Lynn Yoder's murder. However, by early June, he was also accused of the murders of Green, Hayes, Kinnamore, and Columb based on DNA evidence linking him to the crimes. During the investigation into Lee, the police learned that he had an extensive criminal history. Lee's youthful record included a string of juvenile offenses that stretched back to 1984, when he was caught peeping into the home of a St. Francisville woman. It would mark the first of many such offenses. Lee never really outgrew his teenage fetish. As Lee grew older, his rap sheet became more extended, including arrests for attempted first-degree murder, stalking, peeping into homes, as well as break-in and burglary, among other crimes. Lee's arrests and related incidents between 1992 and 2001 were as follows. November 1992, Lee was arrested for illegal entry and burglary of Zachary resident Bob Benji's house. January 1993, Lee and his accomplice, Thomas Whitaker Jr., were arrested for breaking into the home of 73-year-old Melvin Foster, whom they beat with a stick and robbed. July 1993, Lee was sentenced to 1 year in prison for burglary. September 1995, Lee was arrested for a peeping incident and resisting arrest after being chased and caught by police after looking in the window of a woman. During the same month, Lee was arrested again for stealing from a Salvation Army thrift store. August 1997, Lee was arrested after being caught looking into the windows of a woman. August 1999, Lee was arrested after being caught in a woman's residence uninvited for being a peeping Tom and stalking. December 1999, received a suspended sentence on a misdemeanor stalking charge. January 2000, accused of attempted first-degree murder after severely kicking and stomping his girlfriend Cassandra Green at a bar after an argument over Lee's advances towards another woman. While trying to flee from the police following the incident, he allegedly tried to run over the sheriff's deputy with a car. Lee was sentenced to 2 years for the incident. September 2001, Lee was arrested for battery against his wife, but charges were later dismissed. Following the release of Lee's vast criminal history, residents of Baton Rouge were shocked that he was never suspected in the Baton Rouge murders, especially when the focus was changed to a man of color in March of 2003. Moreover, the task force was heavily criticized because Lee had been overlooked after having been brought to their attention by the Zachary Police Department in 2002. The Zachary police suspected Lee of the murder of 41-year-old Connie Warner in 1992 and the disappearance of 20-year-old Randy Meebrewer in 1998. Despite the mistakes made in the case, the task force was congratulated for their work in catching the killer. After Lee had been taken into police custody, the police, with the help of the FBI, immediately were focusing on trying to locate his estranged wife Jacqueline and the couple's 2 children. It was hoped that Jacqueline might be able to provide clues into Lee's behavior and whereabouts during the crimes. Family members suspected she was hiding out of fear. Family members of Jacqueline Denise Lee claimed that she lived in denial of her husband's transgressions, which included stalking, peeping into windows, and infidelity. Jacqueline's aunt claimed she was afraid of her husband, and at one point, against her wishes, he had a mistress move into their home. Initially, Jacqueline and the couple's 2 children could not be traced. Eventually, in June 2003, the FBI located the 3 in Chicago. Investigators were interested in Jacqueline not only for questioning purposes, but also because they needed her consent before they could begin digging up the property of her former residence. Police had been anonymously tipped off that Lee had possibly buried a body beneath a concrete slab, and they were waiting to either confirm or deny the rumors as soon as possible. Investigators finally obtained permission from Jacqueline to dig at their home in the search for clues. 2 other sites were also excavated by police in the hopes of obtaining more information into the murders and disappearance of a Zachary woman. One of the sites included the former home of Lee's mistress, Cassandra Green. Lee had been seen pouring a concrete slab in the driveway of her home in the middle of the night, only a couple of days following Randy Meebrewer's disappearance from her Zachary residence in 1998. During the excavation at Green's previous home, a woman's bracelet of unknown ownership had been discovered. However, investigators were unable to find any evidence of human remains in any of the 3 sites. Investigators had also been looking for more clues into Lee's alleged involvement in the murders by searching a white pickup truck sold to a relative of Green's by Lee. In late May, police seized the pickup once owned by Lee from Cassandra Green's uncle, which was taken to the police crime lab for analysis. A similar truck had been previously connected with some of the crimes attributed to the Baton Rouge serial killer. However, there had been a discrepancy concerning the race and build of the driver, as viewed by earlier witnesses in the investigation, compared with that of Lee's. Such contradictory data had caused investigators to throw doubt on the reliability of earlier testimony concerning the white truck and its connection with the murders. Investigators continued to examine other murders that could have been committed by Lee. The police in Bolton, Mississippi, sought to tie Lee, a former truck driver, to the murders of 4 women found near a truck stop. Lee was now considered the prime suspect in the 1992 murder of Connie Warner and in the 1998 murder of Randy Meebrewer, both of whom were residents of Zachary, Louisiana. As of mid-June 2003, Lee had been held without bond at Parish Prison in Louisiana. Public defender Mike Mitchell, 52, had been appointed to head Lee's defense team during his upcoming hearing. It was suspected that the defense's case would hinge on the reliability of DNA evidence taken from Lee and that obtained from the crime scenes. Prosecutors John Sinkfield and Dana Cummings would be trying the case against Lee. It was suspected that Baton Rouge District Attorney Doug Moreau would seek the death penalty if Lee was found guilty. Until then, Derrick Lee's fate would remain hanging in the balance. Derrick Todd Lee's life was very different now that he lived in one of the 2 isolation cells in the East Baton Rouge Parish Prison. The other isolation cell prisoner was Booker T. Williams, Jr., accused of murder. Lee was separated from the general prison population, standard procedure for high-profile sexual crimes, to ensure that he was not attacked by another prisoner. Like other prisoners in isolation cells, Lee got 25 minutes out of his cell each day. He got no television, but had access to his newspaper every day. Every 60 days, he was allowed 3 hours in the prison recreation yard. Lee could have visitors, but only 3 of them, and they could only come on Wednesdays and speak to him by phone. Lee's most frequent visitor was his mother, but other family members may have come as well. Lee's case, which had been estimated to require some $800,000 in defense expenses, had created a burden for the overworked and understaffed public defender's office. In early September 2003, prosecutors revealed that some witnesses claimed that they saw Lee at the scene of the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace on May 31, 2002. Chris Villemaret and Karen Savoie told a national television program that they saw Lee outside Pace's home the day she was killed. However, the description of the man they saw does not clearly fit Derrick Todd Lee. On Wednesday, September 24, 2003, Lee was formally indicted with the first-degree murder of Tanisha Dene Colombe of Lafayette, Louisiana. Around the same time, DNA tests failed to show a link between Lee and the murder of Connie Warner of Zachary, Louisiana. Lee was formally charged with the attempted murder of a Breaux Bridge woman. Lee was looking at a sentence of 100 years for those crimes, if convicted. On October 14, 2003, Lee pleaded innocent to the first-degree murder charge in Lafayette concerning the death of Tanisha Colombe. He also pleaded innocent to the murder of an unnamed Breaux Bridge woman. Lynn Marino, the mother of Baton Rouge victim Pam Kinnamore, commented on the testimony of the Breaux Bridge woman whose skull had been fractured. She wants everyone to know how vicious he was. They didn't expect her to live. A St. Francisville woman had given Lee's name to authorities months before the last 2 victims were slain. The woman had been stalked by Lee for 2 years. Lee's name had been passed on to the task force, but the implication is that it was not followed up on because the task force was only looking for a white man. Prosecutors, who were seeking the death penalty for Derrick Todd Lee, suggested that they had DNA evidence that linked Lee to 7 murders. The women Lee was charged with killing included Gina Green, Charlotte Pace, Tanisha Colombe, Pam Kinnamore, Carrie Yoder, Randy Meebrewer, who was linked by DNA to Lee in February 2004, and Geraldine DeSoto, 21, who was found beaten and stabbed to death on January 14, 2002 at her Addis, Louisiana mobile home. During a January 2004 hearing into the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney John Sinkfield, sought permission to combine all the evidence from the other cases to use in the upcoming trial scheduled for May. State law allows prosecutors to use evidence from other crimes if they can convince a judge that those offenses are similar enough to the ones being tried to constitute a pattern. Another key piece of evidence that prosecutors hoped to use during the trial was the testimony from Diane Alexander, a Breaux Bridge nurse who testified at the hearing that Lee beat, attempted to have non-consensual sex, and strangled her at her home in 2002. Alexander would have likely been killed had her son not arrived at the trailer during the attack and frightened Lee away. Despite the evidence, Lee continued to plead innocent to all of the charges. In May 2004, a state appeals court ruled that combined evidence from the cases was admissible at Pace's trial, which was delayed several months. The evidence included DNA links to the victims, as well as Alexander's testimony. The decision angered Lee's lawyers, who believed that the evidence was improperly obtained because police used a subpoena instead of a search warrant. In the meantime, Lee's trial for the DeSoto murder was scheduled to take place in August 2004. State Attorney Tony Clayton was prosecuting him for second-degree murder because he couldn't prove an underlying felony, such as forced entry or non-consensual sex, which is required for a first-degree charge in Louisiana. Prosecutors plan to use evidence from other crimes attributed to Lee, including evidence from the Colomb case and the attack on Alexander. Lee's attorney, Tommy Thompson, argued to delay the trial because he wasn't granted enough time or money to properly prepare for the case or review the evidence given to him by prosecutors. However, his plea was denied by the state Supreme Court. On August 5, 2004, Derrick Todd Lee's trial into the murder of Geraldine DeSoto began in Port Allen, Louisiana. One of the first witnesses to be heard by the 6-man, 6-woman jury and District Judge Robin Free was Lee's last victim, Diane Alexander. Alexander pointed to Lee and said during her testimony, "While my eyes were closed, I did not forget your face." She had been beaten so severely during the July 2002 attack that her eyes were swollen shut. Alexander was one of several witnesses to testify against Lee that day. On August 6, 2004, Lee interrupted the testimony of the coroner who examined DeSoto's remains to ask the judge to fire his court-appointed lawyer. Lee told the judge, "My life is on the line here," and that he wanted DeSoto's parents to find out the truth about what happened to their daughter. Lee claimed that his lawyer lied to him and did not represent him properly. However, Lee and his lawyer were able to solve their problems, and Tommy Thompson continued to represent him during the remainder of the trial. Another of the more riveting moments of the trial came when DeSoto's husband, Darren, testified to how he found his wife's body. Darren came home and found his wife lying on their bed in a pool of blood. He was quoted in an article as saying, "I turned her head a little bit, and at that moment I saw her throat was cut wide open." There's no doubt that his testimony made a lasting impression on the jury. Just 4 days later, the jury deliberated. It took the jury just an hour and 40 minutes to come to a verdict. On August 8, 2004, 11 of the 12 jurors found Lee guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Geraldine DeSoto. 6 days later, Judge Free sentenced Lee to life in Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola without the benefit of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. During sentencing, DeSoto's family confronted Lee about the murder of their daughter. DeSoto's father, John Barr, locked eyes with Lee and told him, "You don't know how bad I want to get a little closer to you." He was further quoted as saying, "Thank God my daughter gave her soul to Christ before you took it. We know where your soul is going." Lee's trial for the murder of Charlotte Pace was scheduled for September 2004, where he faced first-degree murder charges. Lee also faced trial on November 3rd for the attempted murder of Diane Alexander and faced another trial in 2005 for the slaying of Tanisha Colomb. Other trials were expected to follow. In September 2004, Derrick Todd Lee faced a second murder trial, this time for the brutal murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, 22, who had been beaten then stabbed to death with a screwdriver and a knife at her home in 2002. 1 month earlier, at the DeSoto murder trial, the prosecution decided not to go after the death sentence because they couldn't prove the required aggravating circumstances, such as non-consensual sex committed with murder, to secure a death sentence. However, Lee's second trial for Pace's murder was different and of specific interest to the families of the murdered victims because for the first time, he faced the death penalty by lethal injection. Realizing this, the defense team, led by Mike Mitchell and Nelville Hollingsworth, made every effort to make sure Lee got a fair trial. Initially, they argued to have the trial moved to another location and have the pool of potential jurors tossed out because of concerns that the ceaseless media coverage of the murders and Lee's arrest would bias the jury. However, State District Judge Richard Anderson, who was presiding over the case, rejected the defense's arguments, believing that it would indeed be possible to find an unbiased jury. After some delays, the trial finally went ahead. The prosecution team, headed by John Sinkfield and Dana Cummings, began their arguments by linking DNA samples taken from Lee with those found at the crime scene. Cummings suggested that DNA, which she referred to as the silent witness, could actually identify someone so particularly, so reliably, so exactly that it was irrefutable evidence. In fact, police DNA expert Julian Naylor took the stand and stated that Lee's genetic profile was so rare that statistically there was a 1 in 3.6 quadrillion, or 1,000 trillion, chance that the DNA would match any randomly selected person. In response to the genetic evidence, the defense questioned the methods used to collect DNA samples and the accuracy of the analysis conducted by an unaccredited lab, finding it inaccurate and unacceptable. The prosecution also tried to link Lee to the murders of Pam Kinamore and Carrie Yoder, whose murders both marked similarities to Pace's. They presented DNA evidence taken from Lee that matched samples found at the crime scenes of all 3 victims. Moreover, the prosecution revealed that all victims exhibited similar bruising on their arms and hands, as well as neck injuries, which they likely received while trying to protect themselves during the struggle. All 3 women had non-consensual sex before being killed. The defense retorted by questioning other items at the scene that were neither linked to Lee nor the victims, suggesting that someone else was responsible for the crime. Interestingly, the defense did not present their own witnesses to support their arguments, but instead relied on cross-examining the prosecutions. One such witness that took the stand was Diane Alexander, who allegedly survived an attack by Lee in 2002. She told jurors her harrowing account of how Lee beat and attempted to have non-consensual sex with her before being scared off by her son. Even though the defense questioned her memory of the event, Alexander stuck to her story, stating that she had never taken her eyes off of Lee and that she clearly remembered the attack. Alexander's testimony, coupled with the forensic evidence, proved to have a significant impact on the jury. On October 12, 2004, after deliberating for just 80 minutes, jurors returned their verdict, finding Lee guilty of first-degree murder. Pace's mother, Anne, broke down crying after the verdict was read. Her daughter somewhere must be real proud that it happened this way. There's evil in the world, and he is the personification of that. The next step that Lee had to face was the penalty hearing, in which the decision would be made concerning whether he would live or die. During the penalty hearing, jurors listened to conflicting statements made by mental health professionals concerning Lee's intelligence. According to the Supreme Court, a mentally retarded convict with an IQ below 70 must be exempted from the death penalty. Testimony by expert witnesses presented by the defense claimed that Lee was indeed retarded with an IQ of between 62 and 65, making it difficult for him to understand the seriousness of his crimes. However, expert witnesses for the prosecution stated that Lee was not mentally retarded, basing their opinions on his decision-making ability and past work experience. 2 men from a construction company where Lee worked as a pipe fitter also testified at the hearing. The men claimed that Lee excelled at his job and was able to read blueprints, which made it difficult to believe he had such a low IQ. Following the arguments, the jury deliberated. It took only 93 minutes for them to reach a verdict. The jury rejected the defense's contention that Lee was mentally retarded and decided to sentence Lee to death by lethal injection. Family and friends of the victims rejoiced, hugged, and cried, most feeling that justice had finally been served. In December 2004, Lee was formally sentenced to death. His lawyers had asked for a new trial, claiming that the jurors were already biased towards Lee before the Pace murder trial even commenced. Defense lawyers also filed documents for a new penalty hearing because Lee was mentally retarded and should not be put to death. In addition to Pace and DeSoto, Lee has been indicted on account of first-degree murder in the death of Tanisha Dene Colomb of Lafayette and booked on first-degree murder counts in the deaths of Gina Wilson Green, Pam Kinamore, Carrie Lynn Yoder, and Randy Meebuer, all of East Baton Rouge Parish. Yet in January 2005, Colomb's family finally decided not to put Lee on trial, since he had already been convicted and sentenced to death. As expected, Lee was not executed, and he died of heart disease at a hospital in Louisiana on January 21, 2016.